This is a training from all of us to you. So it's going to be interactive on our part, and we hope that it's going to be interactive on your part as well. We're going to try to balance what we think you need to know from the code, but you need to let us know what you want from the code. So I'm going to kind of, after Kirk does the first kind of big picture overview, we're going to put it out. I'm specifically going to highlight the co-sponsors and see if you have any questions or issues that you want to get out of it as we go through the details. So we want to make sure you're getting out what you need to. If you have any really specific questions about properties, we'll be happy to meet with you after or whenever on that. But we're hoping that you'll leave here with a better understanding of the zoning code than when you came here. So let me start. This is Dwayne Wilkerson. He's with INCOG. Kirk Bishop, we've already been introduced to him. He's our code consultant for our zoning code. Paul Enix, Permit Center, Development Services, City of Tulsa. Bob Calabas, sign expert, City of Tulsa. That's why we brought him. And Don Warwick, City of Tulsa, and Janine Van Valkenburg, City Legal. So we are here to try to guide you through the day and help you learn something as much as you can about the new zoning code. A couple other things I want to mention. We do have, of course, coffee and water as much as you need throughout the day. Restrooms are really the best way to get to them and through that door over there. So keep that in mind. And at some point, we'll kind of evolve. We'll see how this goes. But we do have a microphone. If it gets hard for us to hear your questions, we'll have someone come around with a microphone so that we can make sure we hear your question and everyone can hear it and we can respond to it. That might be about it. As far as the day itself, of course, we're getting started now. I think we have lunch on your own about 11:30 to 1, so you can enjoy beautiful, freezing cold Tulsa, downtown Tulsa. Find something good for lunch. Then we'll reconvene here at 1 o'clock, and we'll get done when we get done. We will spend a little bit of the afternoon also talking about our processes, administrative processes and application processes that have changed because of the new zoning code. So you'll know what to expect and as you start submitting new applications in this year. So I think that's about all I wanted to say initially. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kirk to start a big part of the session.
Thanks, Susan, and I add my welcome as well. I've known Susan now for 3 years. I work with her, and still, Bob Calabas is the only expert on our panel. It says a lot about our relationship, and I'm hopeful that I can share with you some of my experience and limited expertise about the new zoning code, and happy to answer any questions that Susan suggests throughout the day. We're going to start very generally at a very high level, describing conceptually what's changed, and then our plan is to take a much deeper dive into some sections of the code to give you a far better understanding of the new and the revised provisions that you'll find in the zoning code and other aspects of zoning administration. So to start with the document itself, those of you who've had an opportunity to look at it, those of you who will do so in the future will, of course, notice that it looks a fair amount different than the zoning code in existence before January 1st of this year. It's laid out differently, both in terms of its overall organization, the way the pages within the document look, and the writing style itself. We attempted to use plain English wherever possible to describe code provisions, or at least our version of what plain English is. It's still zoning, after all, and occasionally gets into some degree of obscurity. And the way the navigation of the code works in terms of the kinds of features we've built into the document, I think you'll find a fair amount different as well. We've mentioned, Rich mentioned earlier, the use of illustrations. We've tried to use tables and charts to provide very quick kind of summaries and at a glance condensing of information throughout the document, tables of contents throughout as well. going to show you, those of you who have an opportunity to look at the document as it exists in its digital format may have noticed that it's got some features built into it that I think will be useful for folks trying to find information in the future. The document, of course, is available on the INCOG website and may be available on the city website as well, but the main link is I think, found on the INCOG website. I think I've got it here. You'll find it on the land development page of INCOG's website, downloadable as a PDF file. When you open the document, you'll notice, I think the initial opening view of it will display a table of contents along the left-hand side. As you click on those links, you'll be taken to various places within the document. All of this, for example, is the opening table of contents page of the zoning code. All of those chapter headings, page headings are clickable as links that will take you directly to that section. You know, one of the things that I commonly get questions about is, once I click on a link, how do I get back to where I was? It's kind of an Adobe Acrobat question, but it's one that bedeviled me for a little while before I figured it out. When you open this document in Acrobat, the thing you want to do is go to the page navigation pane and see the previous view. I'm going to add that to the toolbar by simply right-clicking on the toolbar, show page navigation tools, go down to previous view, and then that's going to add the little icon there at the top of the toolbar. That'll always remain in place and allow me to go to various places within the document and then go back to where I was before looking for that information. There are also some links, hyperlinks within the document that are not internal hyperlinks within the zoning code, but hyperlinks to various sections of the city's overall municipal code. I clicked on one there, and though it may come up slowly, I assure you it eventually will. So as I say, we can navigate throughout the various cross-references, not only these table of contents headings that exist both at the document level and at the individual chapter level are clickable links, but the cross-references within the document to various sections are clickable. Here, for example, barely legible. Let me increase the zoom level here. This is the residential use districts table, and you note that many of the uses allowed in residential and in other districts have supplemental standards attached to them, as they did in the previous code. Those are clickable links, and again, I'll use that previous view tool to go back to that table. So that's a kind of interface or a way that the document, I think, is going to be easier for you to use. It's also searchable, as was the previous version of the PDF code. If I search for home occupation, for example, and spell it correctly, it's going to take me to various instances of the use of that term throughout the document, and therefore help me to find the home occupation provision, the definition of that term, and the like. So those are a few ways that the document itself and its the way it's presented, I think, is going to provide some ways to navigate, find information, hopefully understand that information once you find it, that may have been somewhat lacking in the existing code, though certainly not completely. A bit about the organization of the document. I think it's helpful to kind of understand conceptually why decisions were made. I think that will also aid you in your effort to sort of quickly zero in on parts of the code that you want to focus on as you're looking to see what the regulations are, if there are any trapdoors hidden that you should know about as you investigate potential uses of your property or help a client, whatever the case. There are really 5 major groupings of information within the document. Not terribly unlike the previous zoning code. The first major grouping, chapters 5 through 30, are all about the zoning districts. Once I identify through the use of the zoning map, the zoning designation that applies to my property, quickly go to the zoning districts section to determine what uses are allowed on the property, what are the basic lot building regulations that apply to setbacks to building height, coverage, open space, and the like that might apply to the property. The second major grouping, chapters 35 through 50, is all about the uses. So if I want to know, if I have an idea for the use of my property, and I want to know what the zoning, what is that considered in zoning parlance? What's the term that zoning uses to apply to coffee roasting as a land use? I'll know first of all that that's a use-related question, so I know immediately that I want to go to that part of the zoning code. Chapter 35 is really the home of all of the definitions and explanations of the various land use classifications. They're called categories under the new zoning code, use units under the old zoning code, use categories and subcategories under the new zoning code. All of that's going to be explained in chapter 35. Supplemental regulations that apply to individual use types are going to be found in chapter 40. 45 and 50 are reserved more for accessory uses, accessory structures, home-based businesses, sheds, patios, decks, that sort of thing. And temporary uses are, of course, things that are temporary in nature, not necessarily allowed under the zoning, but on a temporary basis they can be permitted. Christmas tree sales, lot pumpkin sales, lot seasonal sales, types of activities. You find the information you need in the temporary use section. The next major grouping is a set of kind of generally applicable regulations, chapters 55 through 65. These are less dependent on zoning category or zoning district, and sometimes less about the use, but are widely applicable to a variety of contexts. Parking is a prime example, signs, landscaping, screening, outdoor lighting regulations are kind of those generally applicable standards found in that third grouping, chapters 55 through 65. Chapters 70 through 85 are the administrative and procedural provisions. If all I want to know is about process questions, how do I obtain approval? What am I looking at in terms of visiting with boards and commissions and staff level reviews with regard to my development proposals? All that information is going to be found in the administrative and procedural grouping of chapters, which are 70 through 85. The most relevant of which is chapter 70, which actually has all of the processes for zoning, land development approvals laid out in sequence, starting with rezonings, special exceptions, variances, and the like. They're all going to be found in that chapter, in individual sections. And we're going to, as the day goes on, we're going to explore all of these chapters, or most of these chapters, in far greater detail, and I'm going to tell you some new things that you'll find in those sections. But I want you to have a basic understanding of how to sort of filter your search through the zoning code as part of this exploration. The final group of chapters, the final 2 chapters, are all like reference material, a kind of glossary of terms. How do I determine, and it's broken up a little differently than in today's, or the previous zoning code, broken up between terms that pertain to measurements. How do I determine what the lot area is? How do I measure lot frontage? How's the setback measured? How's building height measured? Those are all found in the measurement section of the zoning code, chapter 90. The general terminology is all found in 95. One of the things that may be sort of a bit disorienting at first are that definitions of uses are found in Chapter 35. Definitions of measurements in 90, and general terminology, what the word abut means, what the word adjacent means, what a sign is, are all going to be found in the definitions section. So today, those are all kind of grouped together within the definitions chapter, and that makes a fair amount of sense, but sort of functionally, we've divided it up a little differently. So be aware of that as one of the key kind of organizational changes that might throw you until you are initially familiar with that. Did I forget anything really salient about the organization, guys, or the online part? Okay. So I'm going to go from there to talk to you a little more about some of the modernization that went on. Sort of philosophically, when we approached this project, there were really, I don't know, a small handful of big picture objectives. One was to help implement the city's new comprehensive plan, the Planet Tulsa document. And Planet Tulsa, you know, if you, at the end of the day, once you've read it, it wasn't necessarily all about adding a bunch of new regulations, changing the world with regard to zoning and land use, but about enabling the type of development that was beginning to happen in terms of redevelopment of corridors, areas close to downtown, kind of mixed use and exciting activities that we've experienced and maybe on vacation and coming to Tulsa. That was beginning to happen. The plan saw opportunities for more of that sort of exciting, vibrant redevelopment to happen in the future. And so it was about providing tools to enable that sort of thing to happen in the future. At the same time, ensuring that stable residential areas weren't subject to dramatic change without some public process. So it was about sort of protecting areas of stability and accommodating change, desirable change within areas of change. And so, for the most part, that's what the zoning code effort focused on. And it also needed to recognize that with a 45, 50-year-old document, there was some basic modernization that needed to occur. The types of uses identified in the zoning code as allowable in one or more zoning districts needed some refreshing. And so we've attempted to do that. We'll be talking about that later in the day. Things like home-based businesses. What are our regulations that apply to folks who choose to work from their home? Obviously, that world has changed dramatically in the last 50 years. The types of activities that are customary to occur within one's own residence. The values of today are far different than they were before. The realities of today are far different than they were before. Signs is an area where technological changes have resulted in different kinds of opportunities for folks to advertise their businesses, and the code needed to be cognizant of that. So those kinds of modernization type changes are found throughout the document. It didn't necessarily receive tremendous amount of attention because they were kind of changes at the margins for the most part. But we're going to talk about some of that today. In terms of administration and procedures, our mindset when we started this project was to identify more things that were, especially things that were envisioned as appropriate by the folks who participated in the comprehensive planning effort, and things that had historically become pretty commonplace and had often received approval, to move as many of those types of things into the realm of things that could be approved at the staff level as possible. If they had predictable impacts, if objective, predictable standards could be written or were in place to accommodate those sort of things, or we had gained enough experience over the years by using a special exception or a variance process to move as many of those things into a bucket that allowed for staff level or administrative approval as possible. So we've identified and actually accomplished a fair amount in terms of providing opportunities for staff level approvals that heretofore were always things that required at least one public hearing, if not multiple. I think try to add some, just some clarity to the process that's entailed in obtaining various approvals through the use of notice provisions, talking to neighbors prior to hearings, amendments to approvals, whether it's an existing development plan or a special exception, what kinds of things are major amendments that need to go back to the process versus minor that might be administratively approved. We tried to clarify some of that provision and sort of clarify city and INCOG practices with regard to how notice is done and who we reach out to, even though it's not necessarily always legally required. Would be a few examples of the types of changes of streamlining and transparency that we've attempted to add to the administrative and procedural sections, and we'll be taking a closer look at many of those provisions in the next section. Whenever you work on a zoning code, you're always kind of aiming for that 85 to 90% that you hope a regulation works in the vast majority of situations, but you know isn't going to be perfect, isn't going to always address every parcel and its unique context, be it its size, its topography, the area of the community. There's always going to be, in our minds, some need for zoning provisions that are highly customizable or that can be crafted for unique parcel-specific, site-specific development opportunities. Tulsa's always had a provision that has allowed that. The PUD provision has historically been that go-to tool for accomplishing things that just couldn't figure out a way to do under the standard array of zoning regulations and standards. The new zoning code provides us a broader set of those types of tools, ranging from neighborhood-specific overlays that are possible in the future, that are authorized under the new zoning code, a new approach to how the planned unit development process will work. We're going to talk about that later. It's not going to be called that in the future. It's going to have a new name. We've offered up an option that we didn't talk a lot about during the process. It didn't get a lot of notice. I guess we talked a fair amount about it, but folks didn't have tremendous concerns about it. And that's something called the optional development plan. That's something we'll spend some time talking about, how standard rezonings can, at a property owner's election or option, have a development plan attached to it that sort of customizes what the request is. That's something that heretofore required basically a PUD type of approval, a little more process than a standard rezoning, and that has, even in the early stages of the process, received some really positive reviews in terms of what it offers for, in the right circumstances. So those are kind of the types of customization tools that we'll be talking about later in the day. Rich mentioned at the outset some new residential options. We've got a new residential zoning district, some new residential housing types that are very much consistent with the plans call for increasing the range of housing types for today's world. Folks have sort of different expectations in terms of lifestyles and housing choices than they did 45 or 50 years ago. Those types of choices sometimes with an older zoning code require a whole lot of process, and so we've attempted to provide some as-of-right options for new residential building types, ranging from sort of zero lot line patio houses, cottage or bungalow courts, small multi-unit buildings, ways to sort of integrate new housing opportunities, even into some stable neighborhood areas that'll be non-disruptive to the overall context or character in some settings. New mixed-use zoning districts. We'll be exploring some new zoning districts that aren't yet on the map and won't be on the map until folks begin to apply for them or area plans are completed and the city agrees to help neighborhoods or areas do city-sponsored or city-initiated rezonings. But these are some new tools that I think provide some real opportunities to integrate both higher density along some older commercial corridors within the city, provide for the sort of walkable, mixed-use, more transit-oriented development that the plan and its authors, including many members of the community, called for as part of the Plan at Tulsa effort. And will provide some fairly predictable, sort of as-of-right development opportunities for folks who decide to avail themselves of that new mixed-use zoning. So we're real excited about those tools. You don't have to be in the zoning game very long to know that parking regulations can be a real driver or determinant of what can happen on a piece of property. When it's all said and done, there are the rules for how big the building can be, how many units it's going to have on the property are all well and good. But the parking regulations are not up to snuff in terms of accommodating what the zoning says can be accomplished. It can be a real obstacle to redevelop, particularly in redevelopment settings, where land is, where land opportunities are more constrained. Lots are smaller. It's difficult to acquire enough parcels to pull a project together in terms of what I want to do as my primary use and how I'm going to park it. Parking can be a real obstacle. We recognize that from the outset and have provided, in the end, some opportunities for parking relief from the ordinance's older minimum parking requirements that I think are real exciting and provide some real potential for redevelopment opportunities within the core area of the city in particular. That's going to be a strong focus of a later section of the presentation, as is sort of landscaping and some sustainable development opportunities that are built into the code. So those are that's a real high level, big picture explanation of what we're going to explore throughout the day in terms of getting into the chapters. And I think we're going to ask you all to help us as well. If you didn't hear something that promises to address an issue, then we'll ask you to help us identify it.
Okay, thanks. I think that was a great overview of things. Hopefully that started you thinking of things that you want us to talk more about. Before we even do that, I meant to tell you earlier that the code, and you may know this, the code is online. It's on our INCOG website. It's on teamapc.org. So you can obviously go to that website, print it off. We also, we have these for sale in our offices, which is Tower 2, 8th floor. And it's got tabs, and it's done really nicely. And those are $75. So if you wanted to purchase one of those are available as well. We have about a dozen of those right now, and I think we have people assembling some more. So I wanted to make sure you knew that was available to you. And at this point in time, we want to hear from you. We really hope everyone interacts and lets us know what they want to hear. So I'm just going to go through it, through our co-sponsors, and then anyone else just chime in as well. But friend, I'm going to look for faces I know. But it doesn't matter if I know you or not. Speak up. GTAR, is Mike Craddock here? Or GTAR, okay, there you go. So is there something specific that, as a realtor, that you want to make sure we touch on this afternoon?
I haven't thought of one yet.
Okay, well, just keep thinking about it. Anybody else for the realtor community? Yes?
I'd like to know if what changes may be, or if there are any, to present zoning codes, such as if you have IL land, and you still do exactly what you could have done before, or if you have some more things you can do, or you can do less things.
Okay. Let me answer that. We'll just hold these. This will be hard. Okay, I guess just one thing to clarify is that, no zoning, no map changes were made. So you still have the same zoning that you had before. There were some adjustments in certain standards in every zoning district. Parking, uses were very minimal, but we'll talk about that more as we go. Anybody else from GTAR or the Realtor community that has any ideas of things we need to make sure we discuss today? Okay, what about NAIOP? Maybe a little similar, actually, as the realtors, real estate brokers. Anything you think that we need to make sure we touch on? Home builders. Home builders, Stacy, or yes?
Yes, Jeff Smith, CEO of Home Builders. Yeah, thank you guys for putting this on today for not only our members, but our community. Where are we at on the post-adoption issues?
We have not prioritized those yet. We've talked to Planning Commission and City Council about needing to do that. Also Kirk, there aren't funds currently to engage Kirk in that, so we would have to figure out how to put that in our work program and prioritize how we're going to do that. So that's where it is. It's really kind of nowhere, just sitting there waiting to be, worked on.
Is there a particular issue?
Yeah, is there a particular item on there that you're concerned about or you're curious about?
No, I think all four are.
Okay. And I have those, I think ultimately there's more than 4. But, yeah, there's quite a few of those that we need to tackle. Okay. Well, yeah, okay, I didn't even bring that because I didn't want to go down that road, but, okay, so counselors have asked us to look at sunsetting PUDs. That is a monumental task. As you know, some PUDs are partially developed. PUDs were an overlay. The underlying zoning dictated it. They were, the development were clustered all over regardless of underlying zoning. So that is a monumental research task and project. There was also some follow-up sign issues that we were asked to look at, landscaping. Also, some counselors are concerned about development impacts of projects and knowing really the impacts of those projects during the zoning stage, rather than, at this point, City Council, at least one time since I've been here, probably more, have declined an application because of perceived impacts. In my mind, it may be better to know what those impacts are. There may not have been any traffic-related impacts in this particular application. So, those concerns are there now, and they would like to have some real data to back that up. Other issues, you guys?
I think that's it.
Jenny?
HP demolition.
Yeah, that's right. Demolitions in HP districts.
The time frame.
Yeah, the time frame on that. There might be another one, but I'm not remembering it.
No, that's
Okay.
it.
So that's where we are. Sorry, I can't give you a better answer on that one. Home builders, anybody else? John Madden, are you listening?
Yeah, Stacy.
Oh, Stacy. Okay, good. Just trying to get a little heads up. We still want you to ask us a bunch of questions once we get into the details. Okay, AIA. Let's see, yes?
Just listening, kind of get an idea of what's new, what's changed,
Okay, great.
be able to maybe direct the members that aren't here today to the right sources.
Oh, that's
Hopefully more.
great. That's very helpful. Thanks. Anybody else? AIA? Well, Dan, are you listening?
I'm listening. No questions.
No question. Okay. All right, and also the chamber, Cayenne. I saw you in the back. I don't know where you are. If you're gone, but or anyone from the chamber also just have a bigger issue or something that you've heard from other groups that you want to make sure we touch on. Okay. Well, that gets us started. I just hope that the more we talk, the more questions that you'll realize that you have, and we can leave you with as much information as we possibly can.
Well, terrific. Okay, so we're going to now start focusing in on some specific sections, give you some more detail beyond those sort of broad thematic issues I described at the outset. And I'm of the opinion that one of the really key changes in the zoning code is in the parking chapter. So we're going to start with the parking chapter. That's chapter 55, is that right? For those following along at home. And I want to start with an explanation of how the code handles minimum parking requirements. Not a new concept. Most zoning codes have minimum parking requirements still. I can envision a time, and I don't think it's in the not too distant future, where minimum parking requirements may not be a part of many zoning codes, but they still are. The new zoning code takes a little more context-driven focus on parking regulation. To some extent, the previous zoning code did, because it said no parking is required downtown, and then the rest of the city beyond the CBD zoning classification has minimum parking requirements, and they were all the same. The new zoning code breaks that up a little bit more by dividing the city into kind of 3 tiers. The downtown, which, as before, has 0 parking as minimum requirement. No parking is required today. There's absolutely no change from the previous zoning code. And then there's a new second tier, which kind of corresponds to some key redevelopment corridors within the city, and that's the CH zoned areas, and in the future, MX zoned areas. Those areas, the existing CH and any future CH, what does that stand for? Commercial highway? Commercial high, yeah. The CH zoning category. The minimum parking requirements there have been reduced substantially from today's levels. For residential uses, as compared to the previous zoning code, parking was cut in half. For non-residential, the base was cut to about 65%, 55 to 65% of the previous levels, with one important caveat, that the first increment of floor area, up to 5,000 square feet, is totally exempt. Question?
Yeah, but is that based on, I've got a situation where I've got a number of properties owned by a single property owner. And they were on separate lots. Now they're all in one lot. So is that going to impact the whole assessor account number, or how do you define what is included in that for that first 5,000?
The question is, how do you, what if there are maybe multiple uses on a property? Does each one get the exemption?
Multiple buildings.
Multiple buildings, multiple uses.
What defines the area of that property?
Well, I don't know how the area of the property is defined, but I think the answer, I think you'll find the answer in my response, and that is that the exemption is applied to each individual use on a property. So it doesn't really matter if they're on a single parcel or on successive divisions. Each use is exempt for the first 5,000 square feet, if it's one of those uses that is exempt. So if you had a shopping center, which would be the typical example, the 5,000 applies to each use within that shopping center, not 5,000 square feet of the shopping center. Does that make sense? So it's a pretty dramatic decrease, particularly in a small retail center where you'd be hard pressed to find most of the uses within that center, except maybe for the anchor having 5,000 square feet. Question?
I think you just answered. So you're saying per tenant?
Per tenant. Probably better terminology to use in this setting. each tenant. So it is dramatic. And as I say, it applies to CH zoned areas and in the future, any MX zoning that is applied to the map.
You said 55 to 65%.
Yeah, based on, as a comparison to today's, it's reduced to about beyond the 5,000 square feet where the ratio kicks in. Then you'll find that to be about 55 to 65% of what you would have had to provide before January 1st of this year.
I mean, you could theoretically, and I think I know the properties you're talking about, you could get to 0 required parking. You know, if you have very small tenant spaces. And then, of course, he hasn't really talked about it yet, but he'll get to some other ways that you can reduce your parking requirements. So, yeah, you could have CH properties that ultimately ended up with no parking requirements if all of those things were combined. And you know, I guess previously, I forgot the year, 1980, CH, or roundabout, CH had no parking requirements. So we're just really kind of going back to that point in time in some cases.
That's right. Maybe a little more explanation of why the CH. That is, ultimately, we latched upon using CH as a proxy for key redevelopment areas because, one, it didn't used to have a parking requirement, and two, if you look at this zone, if you look at this map and look at the trends in terms of parking variance requests over the past 15 years, there's a high correlation between CH zoned areas of the city and concentrations where folks have had to request parking relief in the future. The overlap, there's the CH zone map, and you see some trends there, and then you look at this map. There's a high correlation between those areas. The overlaps are shown in the green area. The green area would be areas of high concentrations of parking variance over the past 15 years and CH zoning. The red areas on this map are the CH zoned areas where haven't necessarily seen high trends, may not have been as much redevelopment activity within those areas, but they'll be eligible in the future for this new parking, much lower parking standard. Make sense? And your understanding of it at least? So the third tier is everything else. The all other, if it's not CH zone, if it's not MX zone, if it's not CBD, its parking requirement has been reduced somewhat, maybe about 15% from previous levels. We've also added an overlay designation that could be used if there was an instance where there was high parking demand, even in areas where you would normally get parking relief, the CH zone area around a hospital, an area around a college, university, where parking is so much in demand that the reduced levels are creating unanticipated impacts on a neighborhood. There is a way for parking to be reduced parking to be brought back up to the 85% level, the standard level. And that is through the imposition of a parking impact overlay. Just a heads up that there is a tool. If we find that broad application of the CH exemption, the 5,000 square foot exemption or something is causing problems in a particular area, there's a way to overcome that without undoing the whole thing. And that would be this parking impact overlay. So basically, the rest of the city, beyond CH, CBD, parking close to today's level but reduced somewhat, and this parking impact overlay, which is not applied. Haven't heard any instances where there's expectations it would be applied, but it is available. Question?
Is that overlay to help a developer get more parking, or is that overlay a tool to help the neighborhood stop the developer from getting his parking?
The question, who initiates it would be, I think, the more.
Yeah, well, there, who initiates a rezoning, whether it's an overlay or a base zoning district, has one answer. And that is either the property owner, the owner of the property to be rezoned, or the city in the form of the planning commission recommendation and council adoption are the only two entities that can rezone property under this zoning
So
code.
this could be, this concept, at least I think the way you're describing it is, if there's an issue with parking on an existing site that's been given reduced parking in the past, the city could initiate this overlay to resolve that problem.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
And so reverse, so a guy built a building and he spent $5 million and got this parking approval, and the city can come back and say, well, you're affecting the neighborhood too much, so we need to cut your parking back some and kick out some tenants.
No, I don't believe that overlay could be used to sort of retroactively requiring an upgrade of the parking, but saying all future development requests in this PI overlay would have to meet different parking standards than the standard CH, for example. It wouldn't be retroactive or go back against a property that's already been redeveloped, has vested rights, and it has non-conforming status with regard to the new PI overlay. That wouldn't be the case.
I'm assuming that it goes without saying that all of these new provisions can be applied to existing properties. And therefore, any property is eligible for a reduction in parking that exists.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, these new parking provisions, if you have, are applicable to all new and existing development going forward. As a matter of fact, CH zone property that's already provided parking at the older levels could in fact take parking off of their property and use that expanded area to expand the building. And as long as they met today's tier 2 parking level, that 55% reduction, I think you'd be good to go.
The other question would be, when one makes an application for that, is that a staff level review, or what's the process?
There is no special review for the parking itself. If what you were going to do had no other, approvals attached to it, special exception and the like, it's staff level approval. Is that right, Paul?
Yes.
So it changes to the parking in and of itself. Would be staff level unless there was some other aspect of what you were doing that triggered a review under the code.
Could you repeat the questions? Because we're having a hard time hearing back here. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for that reminder. So the last question was, are these new parking provisions available to everybody going forward, existing CH zone properties, existing developments, or only for new projects? My answer was they're available to existing and new projects. One could either develop anew using these reduced parking standards, or reduce their parking and expand the actual use that's on the property such that it was in compliance with the new minimum requirements. And the question before that is, who initiates the parking, a parking impact overlay? This is a question that will come up in your mind a couple of times today. The answer is that either the owner of that property, which is kind of hard to imagine, or the city can initiate rezonings.
So how does the parking impact overlay get implemented? Let's use a specific example of Brookside. Brookside has a lot of parking lots. So with this new tiered parking system, those parking lots are going to start filled in with occupiable business square footage. The parking is going to, people drive to Brookside. It's a walkable community, but most of the draw is driving. So people are gonna start parking in the adjoining neighbors. The adjoining neighbors are going to complain, and then the parking impact overlay gets implemented. So how does that all, and so a few property owners at the beginning of this experiment are going to benefit from a reduced parking count. At what point does the parking impact overlay tool add in when neighbors start complaining about parking in their front yard? Oh, I guess. Just for reference, I both walk and drive to Brookside.
So, yeah, how I could see that playing out, and I'm sure it could play out a lot of different ways, but how I could see it playing out is if, it became a problem, the neighbors started contacting the city councilor, or their city councilor, and then we would be called in to look at doing something about it and probably start meeting with property owners. I just know from being here a few years and working with city council and planning commission, they really want, they don't like imposing things on property owners that the property owners not part of that decision. So I think that's always going to be a discussion. So I don't think there's one clear way it would happen, but I think it may begin the discussion if that starts to happen. And that's an option that we can look at. But otherwise, I don't know. I've always, this parking impact overlay, this was something that kind of came late in the zoning code process that we added because we went through different iterations of parking. And yeah, I've never really known how it would play out. So I don't know.
Using the example of Brookside is probably a really good one for this particular issue. And another thing that we would use to help guide that process if it came to a situation where we knew that something needed to be addressed and we needed to possibly establish this kind of tool for that neighborhood. There is an underlying existing neighborhood plan for Brookside with which the neighbors and the business owners and property owners came together and worked on kind of some defining boundaries where people's comfort levels were, kind of hitting those thresholds with regard to impact of businesses on the adjacent stable neighborhoods. So we would at least have some historical starting point and baseline to help guide decisions with that regard on parking impact for Brookside. Not every neighborhood has that type of situation, but I think that anytime we have an existing land use policy that would help guide that process, we would certainly use that as a base and start from there.
I guess when that scenario plays out, I would hope too that after thoughtfully considering this, the city recognizes that regulation isn't, and zoning in particular, isn't the only way to deal with an issue. That the aspect of parking that's so often overlooked is management. How do we manage supply of parking? What's our on-street parking management provision? Do we have the right parking policies in terms of where parking is allowed on street? Who can park in areas? Do we have the right program in place in terms of the city's participation in providing satellite parking lots within high-use, high-activity shopping areas? And so I hope we would explore those sort of management alternatives before we quickly resort to a zoning tool. Because in and of itself, I'm not sure the zoning tool is the perfect answer. But it's one tool in the quiver. It's one arrow in the quiver that could be used in the future as a sort of remote or last resort. And I've seen it played out in different ways and successfully so. But I would reserve it for those situations where management can't work. I also have fair amount of faith in, particularly in the Brookside area where there's old line operators of some of these properties, particularly in sophisticated markets. Retailers, shopping center owners, managers, they know how important parking is for keeping their clients clientele. So I don't know that people are going to enter willy-nilly into this idea of removing all existing parking and just hoping for the best in terms of their potential clientele finding a place to park. There's some element of market sophistication and response that will play out here, and not everybody will avail themselves of these new minimums, but there are instances where the existing minimums are simply too high in terms of market trends and are at odds with some of your comprehensive plan policies. And so we've changed them, and I think by and large they're going to have positive results. I'm confident of that. So that's the basis of much of the rest of the material in the parking chapter. The table itself, when you go into chapter 55, has all of the land uses that are allowed in one zoning district or another, right in the first column of the table. And the three columns, the CBD parking, the CH and MX parking, and the all other, are conveyed there on the first table. You'll see that many of the land uses have the 5,000 square foot exemption associated with them. Many of the standard commercial, retail, service, even restaurant type uses will have that exemption, that 5,000 square foot exemption. So once you understand what the base parking is, there is another important part of the parking chapter, and that is, what can I do as a property owner, as a developer, in terms of making a locational decision, or in terms of the type of amenities or creativity of my designers and planning team to further reduce my parking. Maybe I'm in an area where I don't have CH zoning, I can't get it. But I still think that the minimums of the parking of the ordinance are too high, and are going to make it difficult for me to get this property developed in a way that I think makes sense in terms of the financials and the bottom line. Well, there's a section following the parking table called parking reductions and parking exemptions and credits, I think, that explains a number of ways that the minimums established by that table we just looked at can be further reduced. I can count motorcycle spaces as parking spaces, and I can double up. I can, every 2 motorcycle spaces I provide, which is going to take up less space on my property, is going to be counted as a single motor vehicle space. I can provide, I can elect to provide long-term, secure indoor parking for employees, for example, and get credit for providing those spaces. Every 10 secured bicycle spaces, and this is more than a bicycle rack. It needs to be indoor in a locker behind a locked fence that provides really secure bicycle parking. You can get credit for that, staff level approval. If I provide space on my property for a car share vehicle, or in the future a bike share station, I'll get credit for doing that. I can count each car share space as 4 vehicle spaces, so a significant reduction, and a 10 space bike share station as 2 spaces. I can count publicly available parking within, I think, 1,000 feet. Is that right? 1,000 feet of the subject property. I can count spaces within that lot as providing some of my needed parking. Each 4 publicly accessible parking spaces. It doesn't have to be a publicly owned parking lot, but it's got to be a public parking facility. I can, for every 4 spaces in that lot, I can reduce my parking by 1 space. And for the first time, I can count spaces that exist on the street. If parking is allowed on the street in front of my business, I can count those spaces towards meeting my minimum parking requirements. Only the spaces on my side of the street. Or if there is maybe a park on the other side of the street, I can count those spaces as well. But basically, we're saying each side of the street gets to count the spaces on their property. Unless the other side of the street is not developable, then I could count those spaces. So those parking credits and reductions provide some pretty significant opportunities for further reductions.
Are those on-street spaces just the spaces within your block, fronting your property?
Fronting your property. I think it's every 20 feet of frontage, would count that as a parking space, whether it's striped or not, as long as you can park there. Each 20 linear feet is a parking space. Any questions about those credits? So those are on top of the already reduced minimums. None of those things require any special review, no special exception, no trip to the Board of Adjustment or Planning Commission. Just need to prove up objectively that you met the requirement, or met whatever standards and requirements are associated with that parking credit.
So that could require the submittal of permit applications to have additional information to support that.
Yes.
Just the administration.
Don is clarifying that you may need to provide some additional information with your permit application to show that you've met the criteria. And that would sort of be a non-code issue that we'll probably talk about later on. Some of the things that may be required for you to prove up that you're eligible for some of these new as-of-right options. But other than that, no additional fees or public hearings required for these reductions. Yes, sir.
We have several properties that are retail that have way more parking than they need to have. We have many properties that are retail that have way more parking than they really need to have. And in the past, we've looked at some mixed use verification for reductions in that. Is there anything in the code that addresses that provision specifically?
Yes. Perfect segue. I'm glad we put you in the front row. I got some scenarios there, but I'm going to go directly to your question. Beyond those as-of-right parking credits and reductions that I just went over, the on-street spaces, the public parking spaces close to your property, bike and all that, we still have, under the ordinance, the ability to reduce your parking by sharing it with a use that has different peak operating times. And we have an objective methodology that would allow for a staff level approval of that under the code. And we still have the ability to go to the Board of Adjustment for relief. And not only that, but the relief will be in the form of a special exception rather than a variance. And the key there is that the test for whether that ought to be applied is a little less rigorous for a special exception than for a variance. Technically, variance, you need to show that your plight is really unique and poses some really significant hardships in terms of your ability to use that property for economically beneficial purposes. Less so with the special exception. So the shared parking methodology, we have a formula that's presented in the ordinance for how you determine what you can assume in terms of sharing parking within a multi-user situation. The formula looks like, I know you can't see that very well, I apologize, we'll blow it up a bit. There's a formula in the ordinance at a table like this, and basically what you do is you figure out, look at that tape, the parking minimum table at the front that I showed you. What's my standard parking requirement? You figure out all the spaces you would be required there. I came up with the scenario, a 100-unit hotel is going to share spaces, and the requirement for that is 0.65 spaces per room. So at 65 spaces would be required as a standard. Medium-sized restaurant might require 12 spaces. I've got some assembly banquet hall space within this facility that might require 30 parking spaces. some associated retail might require about 50 spaces. The standard, if you added all those up, the minimums of all those uses combined would have required 155 parking spaces for this particular scenario. If I go through this formula, basically what I say is I look at all the times of day during the week and the weekend, and I determine, this is the Urban Land Institute methodology for shared parking, pretty well known within the industry. And I look at all those times, I find the highest one, and I see that in this particular scenario, given the uses that I've combined here, I've reduced my parking by about 12 spaces. Different combinations of uses could be much more dramatic than that, but you have uses that have like high evening peak times that all peak out at about the same time. That kind of works against you in a sharing situation. So the point is, there is an objective methodology for you to apply your shared parking, present the information at staff level to the permit folks, and they can say your parking is reduced from the standard levels. Then you're saying, still not working for me. I've done my own parking study. I've done this a million times in a million different markets. I want to go to the Board of Adjustment and make my case for further relief. You're going to use the alternative compliance parking section of Chapter 55, which says the Board of Adjustment can approve a special exception based on data that you provide them and your explanation of why, after all said and done, all these things, you still need some relief. So we've retained the existing option, made it the test a little less rigorous, I believe, and provided a whole lot of ways for that you can avoid that trip to the board in the first place. So I think we've made some real headway with regard to parking for a lot of situations. And I don't think we've done so in an irresponsible way. I trumpet the enabling aspect, the responsiveness to market and redevelopment activities, but I am sensitive to the concerns of those who want to move slowly with regard to revolutions in parking and not say that we trust the market to figure this out always, and to not cause adverse impacts on nearby neighborhood areas. So I think we're trying to strike a balance there.
Express allowance for pervious paving material.
Yeah.
Elaborate on that.
So the existing zoning ordinance, what's the language, Paul? Says the old zoning ordinance, dust-free paved surface or something. All weather, yeah, dust-free all-weather surface. And it's a little vague. The new code uses some variation on that language, but it expressly allows people to provide for pervious pavement systems or permeable paving material as a way to meet that standard. This is to address, maybe reduce your stormwater loading impacts, provide for, less runoff on your property, maybe use some technology, or maybe get some sort of LEED certification that you were going for, environmental recognition. For whatever reason, if you want to use that, the code there wouldn't be a question at the counter of interpretation about whether you've met that dust-free hard surface standard language. So just a clarification, there's some additional explanation of what the pervious paving material needs to consist of, or the test for, doesn't mean a gravel parking lot necessarily, but a recognized pervious pavement system would qualify and meet the parking design standards of the ordinance that have always existed. Everybody hear that question? I'm sorry, I forgot already to repeat the question. This is all about the what it means to expressly allow pervious paving in the ordinance. Go ahead. There's another question.
Is there going to be any relief for detention if you've got reduced parking, the parking's used for detention?
there's no, the ordinance, the zoning code itself does not address that issue. And I don't know, as a matter of practice, what kind of credit you'll get from the stormwater folks. I can't answer that question. It's a good one. Have we,
There's been discussion about an incentive program that would allow you to use low-impact development to possibly offset stormwater fees, but at this point in time, it's really just a discussion. But it is something that city staff are thinking about in different departments.
the third bullet on this slide is a new provision I want to bring to your attention. And that is that for large-scale retail uses, the ordinance for the first time has a maximum parking requirement. It's and it's 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet. So basically the ordinance says if you're providing more than 225 spaces, and that would be roughly 70 to 90,000 square feet of retail or bigger, that you'd be limited to providing a maximum of 4 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet, unless you got approval for an alternative landscape plan, a staff level approval to address the stormwater impacts of all that pavement that you're going to be providing. You're going to maybe use some pervious paving material. You're going to use bioretention for some of your landscape areas. They're all just examples of techniques that would maybe qualify for the staff level approval of the alternative plan, and therefore a higher parking than allowed, more spaces than 4 per 1,000. And that was based on our examination of some previous big box type retail development in the city and elsewhere. Do I have that right? The alternative landscape plan. At one time, we had proposed that be a special exception, which would have been a fee and a trip to the board, but now there's an administrative way to exceed that maximum, and it does only apply in that one instance. Very large scale retail, large format retail. Yes, sir.
Some communities where there is a maximum, there's a maximum. In other words, if you exceed the maximum by some special circumstances, like you're describing with the landscape, there's still a maximum on that. Is that the case here?
No. What could be approved through the alternative landscape plan approval process has no set limit attached to it. So the question was, is there a maximum that can be approved even through the alternative landscape plan approval process for folks who want to exceed the 4 spaces per 1,000? And the answer is no. There isn't a upset limit on how much parking can be approved for folks who want to avail themselves of that alternative landscape approval process. Another new feature you'll find in the parking chapter, is for the first time some minimum requirements for outdoor bicycle racks associated with, not with industrial or warehouse uses, but for mostly uses that you can anticipate some level of bicycle traffic, libraries, schools, even retail. And most of those are set at about 10% of your vehicle parking. And it just requires a secure bike rack located near the entrance of fairly near the entrance of the land use. I guess I should mention, and there are some standards that it can't be in a mud puddle. It's got to have a hard surface, and it's got to actually be secure and be something that folks can attach their bikes to. The minimum requirements for that bike parking, the number of spaces, as well as the design standards, are expressly eligible for the Board of Adjustment to wade through the special exception process. So just as with the vehicle park, the alternative compliance with the vehicle parking, the board can consider requests for relief from the bicycle parking requirement. requirements and with the design standards through the special exception process. Also added in the parking chapter feature you'll see is for uses that are going to have a drive-through aspect to it, drive-through window or lane for folks to access a service or directly from their vehicle. There are, for the first time, some minimal stacking requirements. How many feet of stacking lane need to be associated with both the window that you order from and the window that you pick up from, if it's that sort of context. So, and they are set at fairly minimal levels, but for the first time there are some objective standards that you'll find for drive-through stacking. And the parking chapter is also the home of a new section that describes a very general requirement that the route for folks who are going to be walking through a larger off-street parking lot need to be clearly indicated as the preferred routes for pedestrians, where they cross the main traffic lanes in front of a business, or maybe where they're walking down vehicle travel aisles, that there be some indication that this is an area where you're going to encounter pedestrians, and that pedestrians can say, this is the best place for me to navigate my way from the public sidewalk to the main entrance, or from my parking stall to the main entrance of the use. Doesn't require any additional area or pavement be set aside, but it does require some indication of where that pedestrian activity is intended to occur.
How large parking lot do you identify?
Is there a threshold? The question was, how large a parking lot does that apply to?
Residential units or there's some exemptions.
The pedestrian circulation.
Which
It applies to non-residential commercial uses, residential buildings with more than 4 units. So basically, non-residential and multifamily residential generally. There isn't a size threshold beyond that. Yeah. Any more questions about parking? Yes.
If we go in for parking variance, or not, that's the wrong word, but parking update to the new code, does that initiate other code provisions that we have to hide behind on existing parking?
The question was, if we go in for a new parking configuration or minimum on our property, is that going to trigger us to come into compliance with a whole bunch of other code sections?
It's going to be site specific, it's going to have to be, one size doesn't fit all for the answer to that.
I mean, if you were expanding the size of your parking lot, clearly you might be triggering compliance with some new landscaping requirements for the increment that you're adding. The ordinance is very clear that parking lot landscaping needs to be applied to entirely new parking lots and expansions of existing parking lots to the extent of the expansion. I think, though, based on your previous questions, that you might likely be decreasing the size of your parking lot. And in that circumstance, it's hard to imagine you'd be triggering some new landscaping
Provisions,
because they're based on proximity, number of spaces or proximity to trees located near parking spaces.
if you were decreasing it in order to build something new, that would, you would have to comply.
You might trigger new landscape provisions over the entire property for a portion of the property being developed.
I would suggest a pre-application conference in that instance. Because you're asking a really good question. And, you know, my initial instinct was it's hard to imagine, but, you know, Janine makes a good point that maybe the reduction in your parking isn't the only thing that's happening. It's something else that it's in the back of your mind is going to happen, and that's going to, you know, have cascading effect in terms of new code provisions. So, so you'd be well advised to sort of test the waters informally with the discussion before getting too far down the road with that permit request.
Just like that.
Just like.
Paul, on Chapter 11, I assume the handicap parking numbers will be related to the required parking, reduced required parking, is that correct? That if we have reduced parking, we also have reduced handicap parking?
I think handicap parking has always been tied to actual parking provided parking rather than ordinance minimums.
So if I've got a reduced approval for reduced parking on a go basis, that number of handicap spaces based on that reduced?
It's based on what's provided.
Yeah, if you make use of the lower minimums, your obligation in terms of disabled parking is going to be lower as well on a proportional basis. Yeah. Good questions. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about what some of the implications in terms of submittals and what's going to be going on at the permit counter and development services may mean with regard to parking. And I'll turn it over to Paul to help explain some of that.
We currently have done our best, if we're writing a letter regarding the plan review of one of your parking designs, to include all the options, available options. If you don't have enough parking spaces, obviously we'll say you can go to the board and require a reduction, but also we would include other options. As you can see now, that book of options is huge. I don't think there's any way we can possibly get all those options in the letter unless we write you a very, very long letter. So the letters we write back to you won't necessarily include all the available options. Puts more responsibility on the designer's part to look into the code and find what options are available, and there are many options. Parking is going to be much easier under this code to meet those requirements. There are a couple of things that I would like to make sure you're thinking about. The bicycle spaces that we mentioned are required. That means when you submit that plan to me, now they're only in certain uses, but when you submit that plan and you don't have the bicycle spaces on there, there's no way I can approve that. So you need to make sure that those are just little things that you haven't done before. Put in a couple of bicycle spaces, for example. Another thing, the designs that you find here in this parking chapter are applicable to all parking, not just required parking, which is a difference in the way the code is written. Not sure if it's a difference in what we intended to begin with, but it didn't say that in what we call the blue code, the old code. So even if you're building a downtown parking area where it's not required parking, it still has to meet the design standards. The shared parking, we used to call it non-simultaneous, and you had to go to the board. As Kurt was mentioning, it's be easier now because it's staff level, but you do have to have an agreement. So an agreement is required. Likewise with off-site parking, again, it's at staff level, and you have to provide an agreement if the property is not under the same ownership. The plan that we were talking about, the pedestrian circulation plan, that's easily included within your site plan, your parking plan. So I think probably your basic designs are going to include most of that. You just do need to take a little bit of a look at it and make sure that it's going to be obvious to us that we've got those routes in place for the pedestrians. Any questions did you have?
Well, so are you saying that it's your required parking, that you have to have 10% of your parking? That, like, what if you don't have any parking requirement? You have to?
It's based on your meeting your required parking spaces.
Okay.
Now, well, it's actually in addition to, is it not?
The bike parking is in addition to
It's in
the
addition
vehicle
to.
parking, but it's based on the minimum requirements.
Yeah. So if you don't have any requirement. And the last one was on that pedestrian circulation. Do you have an example in the book that kind of shows visually what?
Do we? I don't believe so.
Can you repeat that
Can you
question?
repeat the required parking and bike parking?
The question was, for the required parking, if there is no required parking, do you still have to provide a bicycle space? And the answer is no.
The last question was, is there a visual diagram or example of the pedestrian route, how you meet the pedestrian route? And unfortunately, the answer is no on that. We don't have a visual in the code at the moment. Maybe something we look at adding as a prototype for how you could easily meet that requirement. A typical. Yeah, Paul's mention of the parking agreement. If the off-site parking, if you're proposing to provide your parking off-site, other than on the subject where the principal use is, that you have to have a parking agreement. That's a good reminder. If it's not, if you don't own both properties, you do have to show an agreement to the staff that you have worked out some sort of agreement to use that parking.
We've done away with the special exception requirement.
Correct.
That's all
Correct.
staff level, as long as you have an agreement in place.
Yes, yes, and moreover, we've increased the distance. It's now within 1,000. Did I lose my mic?
You lost your mic.
Yeah,
Mike is gone. Yeah.
I lost my mic.
Again, if you could repeat the question, it'd be helpful.
Yeah, there was a question clarifying that off-site parking is no longer going to require special exception approval. Today you go to the board to say, I got an agreement with the church down the road to use their parking, and they often said yes. We decided to make that a staff level approval. The distance is, what do we determine?
It's 1,000.
1,000 feet, which is up from the older. Yes, sir.
What type of zoning would be required for the off-street parking that's not on site?
Good question. What's the answer, Paul? The zoning is that it has to be at least the zoning that would have accommodated the use that you're parking, or parking that would have allowed you to put a parking lot on that property. Okay?
So it would require parking lot designation zone.
Right.
Or
Similar
some
zoning
kind of
to
commercial
use.
zoning that allowed for
So you
non-accessory.
just couldn't use the church parking lot.
If it was
to
in our
provide
zone,
off space parking for commercial use.
if it was our zone property, that wouldn't probably be administratively approvable. You'd have to go to the alternative compliance route in that case.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm back. I don't know if that's good news or bad news.
Question?
Can I go back to the design of the required pedestrian path in the parking lot? Is a 5-foot marked path made of a different material? Paint, what is that?
Could be, all the above.
If I've got one remote spot, does that need a path bid?
well? Every parking spot has to have access to the tap?
No, there needs to be a designated, identified route leading from, not going to each individual parking space, but from the main parking areas.
For how many parking spaces?
Well, there is no threshold minimum. You need to show those for the property in general.
And that's a painted pathway?
It could be.
It's non-slip though.
I'm sorry?
It's a non-slip pathway of a different material than the driving surface.
Yeah.
What's the purpose?
I'm sorry?
Why is this in the code?
As I indicated before, it's really about the safety of pedestrians within parking lots, and to indicate to pedestrians where they might best decide to traverse the area from where they park to the business that they're going to, and for vehicles to be aware that they may encounter pedestrians within these areas. So we go from the parking chapter to a closely associated chapter, at least partly, and that's landscaping and screening. And should I run through the changes you want to talk to them about?
We can do it either way.
Let me have Dwayne talk to you a little bit about landscaping, because you're probably going to be talking about landscaping in the future.
A lot, yeah. Okay, I think as, whoops. Okay, is this working? Yeah, it's great. Okay. Okay, the landscaping stuff, really, there are not significant changes to the landscape standards that the designers are used to working with right now. But what is changed significantly is that in commercial zoning applications, the building setbacks have been greatly reduced. So that the definition of a street yard for the designers in the room is linked directly to those building setback lines. So as a result of reducing those building setback lines and reducing those street yard requirements, we've increased the density of the trees a little bit and within that street yard that's left. So that's something that as you get into the details of working through the zoning code, you'll need to look at that fairly closely. Other things that have changed is in that street yard definition, historically we have not included anything adjacent to a highway, for instance, an expressway. And now there is a street yard requirement there, so there are trees required adjacent to those highway edges. So there's some things about it that in concept it really hasn't changed a lot, but on the ground you're going to see significant changes just because of the way those street yards are calculated. There are also street trees required in the MX districts inside the code where there's no street yard there at all. It does not affect the central business district where there are no building setbacks. It's only the MX districts that require street trees. So since we were working through that MX district, it was important to make that distinction between the zero setback line in an MX and in the central business district. We haven't really touched the central business district from a landscape standard. Also, as a result of reducing those street yard setbacks, the parking space calculation that we have typically looked at, where there's one tree for 75 feet, I think it is, on a large parking lot, that's been removed. So every parking space now, no matter how big or small the parking lot is, there's got to be a tree within 50 feet of any parking space. So that that sliding scale of how big the parking lot is, and the tree density, that's been removed. So we're just basing it all on that size.
But it has to be on your property. You got a 50-foot
Yes,
wide lot.
yes, yeah, the question is, it does have to be on your property, and the answer to that, yes, it has to be on your lot, so. Now, there are times, and we can get into more weeds if you want to, but as you get deeper into the code on MPD, for instance, that, we may be able to manipulate that a little bit, because then you'll set your own standards, but just straight zoning, it has to be on your property.
Could never be in the right of way, the street tree?
Well, I think the only place that we allow them in the street right-of-way is in the MX area, so typically we do not count trees out in the street right-of-way for our parking standards.
Dwayne,
Jim.
did I understand you say every parking space must be within 50 feet of a tree?
Yes,
And it used to be within 50 feet of a landscape area.
correct. That's right, but it's gotta be from a tree. So,
Actual tree.
yes,
And do we have a minimum area out of that landscape area?
yes, and that minimum area has been increased a little bit. I don't remember, yeah, it's just a little bit larger.
64.
Matt?
And Dwayne, you said that the trees, anytime you abut a highway or freeway, you've got to provide additional trees.
Correct.
Is that going to be, several parts of the question. One is, if there's a service road between you and a highway, is that still applicable? And if that's the back of your building, that faces the highway, is that still required? The reason I ask is because signage is a really critical issue for some of our clients. I've got trees up there that are blocking people's ability to see their signage, and that's a real problem.
I think that the easy answer to that is if there is a street yard, there are tree requirements, and those street yard standards are enhanced from what they were before. So if there's a street yard that is in any zoning application, there's a tree requirement inside that street yard. I mean, we always have to look at it specifically, but if it's in the back or the side or wherever, and there's a public street there, that street yard is probably going to be in place, and trees are going to be required there. As far as signage issues go, most signs are taller than most trees around here, so I think the tree requirement and the design and the tree selection, all of that's going to be part of the design process. So if there's a conflict, you've either got to put a shorter tree or just keep the sight lines clear.
Has our definition of what a tree is changed?
No, it hasn't. Now, one thing that we have, I keep seeing your hand pop up back there, and I won't go too far, but one thing that we have not done yet that we'll do fairly quickly, hopefully, is the Blue Code had a list of trees that we had historically accepted. We'll continue to use that until we update that in the not too distant future. So we'll continue working with that approved tree list. Now, if a landscape architect approves is part of the design process, I think we've given them the ability to ignore that tree list and just do whatever an appropriate design is.
My concern was, it seems to me that we're limiting ourselves to little trees. And because of, as they grow, they're going to have a much larger area which they cover. So does the code allow those trees to get bigger so you don't have to cut it down and put in 2 more trees?
There's nothing in the zoning code that requires anything to be trimmed or requires any trees to be planted small. Those are strictly design choices and then property maintenance choices. So there's nothing that restricts a tree size. Mark?
On existing projects, say like a school campus, if they're expanding, they're building, and adding a new building, adding a parking lot, obviously, I would assume that we're gonna have to make that new parking lot, that new area comply with the landscape code. But in a case where you have large pieces of property, at what point do we stop? I'm assuming we just can't get the whole campus up to the landscape code with all the existing infrastructure. Like, is there a provision in the landscape code that defines your project limit? If the property limits on like a school or a large shopping center is gonna be huge, it's just infeasible to get them up to landscape code.
There's nothing in the code that defines that I'm aware of, but I think that as historically been done, we're looking at the project. So if you're, and these guys may correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the standard is going to be basically like it's been, that if you're adding a building and adding parking spaces, then you have to meet all those standards. So, but I don't think right now it was anybody's. We'll have to study that in detail on a particular project. But
That's
generally,
been the policy, but what really wasn't in the code, I didn't know.
Right. Yeah, the way the code is written right now, and there's some things about the code in the zoning code that we really wanted to get deeper into, but believe it or not, after 3.5 years of working on it, we just didn't have time to get down to everything, and that was one of them that didn't get really addressed. But I don't think there's anything in the code that changes that. One thing that I will also mention is there is a screening standard that is required that is going to affect landscape plans, and that screening standard, there's a couple of different options. The screening standard is based on the proximity of parking to the public right-of-way, I believe. And so you've got an opportunity to either do a 3-foot high screening fence, or it's a low-profile screen with a 3-foot high fence, or I say fence, a masonry wall, or you've got to have shrubs. So that's something that is additional to what was in our previous code. We have defined what the density of that shrub planting has to be and how big a shrub has to be, but we really haven't given any guidelines on the type of shrubs or any of that kind of thing. So it's really just a very basic screening step right now. What am I missing?
Alternative compliance.
Oh, yeah, the alternative compliance. Yeah, the alternative compliance landscape plans are a big part of the reason that we've expanded that is there's a fair amount of development that is seeking LEED certification or some type of a green building certification. Our blue code, of course, did not recognize any of that. So really what we've tried to do is not to regulate it or to define what might be used there, but to get out of the way. So we have an option in the code that allows the alternative compliance standards to be presented to us, and as long and really that's going to be approved. That's going to be looked at staff level, and it's going to be up to the designer, whether it's an architect or an engineer or landscape architect, whoever that is, to show that this is an integral part of that LEED certification. And if it is, you don't have to go get special approval for that. You just come to, in that particular instance, you come to NCOG, and we'll review that with you. And once we're satisfied that it's actually a legitimate LEED certified project and that it meets some level of standards that are not part of the code, then we can approve those at staff level. Also, the alternative compliance landscape plans, going back to the parking standards a little bit that we talked about a little while ago, when a parking area does get larger than it is allowed, then you can come to, and again, that's an NCOG question that'll come through us, but you will have to show to us how the alternative compliance landscape plan helps mitigate additional urban heat island effects or helps protect the watershed or some of those kind of things. So those you'll have to probably include additional density of trees in the parking spaces. I mean, we'll have to look at it on a site-by-site basis, but that is an option that we'll review administratively. And if you agree with our assessment of that, you won't go to the Planning Commission, but if you don't, you always have the option to go to the Planning Commission for their approval. Oh, one other thing that I meant to mention is that somebody asked about tree definitions and those kind of things. We did bump up the size of a tree. I think our blue code required a 1-inch tree and 6 feet in height. Well, the new code goes up to 1.5 inches and 8 feet. And the evergreen tree size, I think, also bumped up a little bit. So the sizes are a little bit larger, but other than that, there really were no different tree standards. One thing that I will mention is that and Paul probably sees this more than I do, but in the landscape plans that are submitted to us and to the city, we get a fair amount of them that are designed by people other than landscape architects or engineers or architects or people that are allowed by the state to submit those plans. But what we have required in the zoning code is if the site has an area of more than 50,000 square feet and or a floor area of more than 15,000 square feet, then those landscape plans do have to be prepared by a licensed professional, whoever the state recognizes as a design professional for those standards. We have not really enforced that in the past, and that's something that you'll see that's different. Most of you that are in the room today, I think most of you that have been on the design side of things would have been perfectly acceptable to submit a plan, but that's something that is in our code now.
Mark, this may not be the appropriate time, but at some point I'd like you to discuss the relationship between NCOG and the city, submitted processes, and whether the new code has any implications of change.
Okay. Somebody gonna remember that? Okay. Okay. Anything else while I've got a hold of the mic? Oh. Yeah, I think our discussion up here is getting down into the weeds on where trees are required and screening fences but I guess what I'll say is that as you're working on new site plans that will be submitted, just look closely at the screening walls and the screening fences and the trees that are required. So I think what Paul's trying to tell me is that if there is a screening fence or wall required, that is in addition to the trees that may need to be removed.
For an F1 screening fence, you have two options. You can provide a masonry fence, or if you provide another type of fence, like a wood fence, you have to have a tree every 25 feet. I want to mention that tree every 25 feet because I think you will miss it when you submit that plan to me. So I was trying to head that one off at the pass and have you think about it.
And the new ordinance will state the instances in which that F1 fence is required or that S1 shorter screen is required. It's not just a general requirement, but there'll be instances in industrial use, a budding residential or something where the ordinance, the code will expressly state that a F1 screening fence needs to be provided. A PK parking district, a budding residential, a screening fence will be expressly required. So you'll know those instances, but the fence is but part of the story. The fence is either a masonry wall or a wooden fence that includes trees planted at a rate of 1 per 25 linear feet. A couple other things I wanted to amplify from Dwayne's presentation is and it sort of presages something I'm going to get to in a bit, and that is this idea of increasing. First of all, I want to clarify something that most of us know. Any new requirements in here apply to future development. Nobody's got to go back and retrofit their property to bring it into compliance with any new of these landscaping or parking requirements. But to the extent that new development occurs or expansions of existing development, one or more of these requirements might be triggered on a proportional basis if it's an addition. The street yard landscaping that increases from 15% to 20%, I think, under the, let's call it the green code versus the blue code. The idea there is for all of the non-residential districts that had a minimum street setback, that street setback was 25 feet under the blue code. Under the green code, it's reduced to 10 feet. So we've decreased the required building setback from the street. But as we thought about that more, we thought, well, we need to make the landscaping requirement more proportional to that reduced area. So on the one hand, we've allowed more developability, bring the building closer to the street, consistent with the plan and walkability principles and all that. But the reduced setback area is going to require 20% landscaping as opposed to 15. That's that right? Yeah. Something Paul mentioned about the parking, I wanted to clarify with regard to landscaping, and that is, he mentioned that the parking design standards of the new green code apply to all provided parking, including the CBD. So the parking design standards, pavement material and the like, will apply in the CBD. That doesn't mean landscaping does. Only the parking design standards, not the parking lot landscaping standards. At this point, the green code retains the existing exemption from, or at least partial exemption for CBD zone properties. Just wanted to clarify that for some of us, the landscaping is part and parcel of parking lot design, and I see that, but in the code's view, they're separate issues. Just wanted to clarify that. Any other questions about landscaping, screening? Before we move on, Janine?
When have you intend to adopt by regulation a list of trees?
Yeah, there's actually a provision in this code that I think allows the development administrator to adopt a new set of trees. So that's something that'll be coming, but it has not happened yet. But again, I want to just reiterate there, that set of trees can, if you're a licensed landscape architect, that set of trees doesn't have any meaning. So you guys, as licensed landscape architects, have the freedom to design and use any tree that you think is appropriate and in its location. And that might actually be for any design professional, or did it just say specifically landscape architects? Okay, architects, landscape architects, and engineers, but there is that flexibility specifically for that group to step outside of those approved trees.
I'm assuming parking garages are exempt.
Except in your particular project. Yeah, that's right. No, obviously, parking structures. Now, if that's true for the parking space as it relates to a tree, but the building is still a structure, so there's some building setback, so there may be trees along a street right-of-way, depending on what the zoning is that you're working with.
Dwayne, the building code also has landscape requirements. Are those going to be, are they going to be brought in to match yours, or are they going to be, because I have had to put, well, the city has had us put certain kinds of trees in properties before, so they're saying.
In the building code?
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any requirements in the building code for landscaping.
Okay. Well, I guess I'm incorrect. I mean, I've had the city had us put in trees before, so I assume that's what it was.
Yeah, that was probably part of just the plan approval process, and there was probably some reference to the actual zoning code, but I don't think any of us are aware of anything in the building code that would have triggered that. It's all linked to zoning. Oh, the comment there is that there are some areas in Tulsa, like the Brady District, where there is some kind of a master plan for street tree construction, so there might have been something from that perspective, but again, that's from some other code or ordinance somewhere, not the building code.
The final pages of the landscape chapter are devoted to a subject that's tangentially related to landscaping. We couldn't find a better home for it, and that's the new outdoor lighting regulation. The existing zoning code uses some fairly, imprecise, nebulous language with regard to the way outdoor lighting is supposed to be designed.
Yeah, they can. One of those issues was the old Kennebunkport formula, and that has been removed from our review process.
For some folks, particularly the setback, the relief from setback requirements, this administrative adjustment process offers a potentially streamlined process for you to submit something to staff. There'd be a certain waiting period after notice is provided, and at the end of that period, they can approve the administrative adjustment. Or they can kick it up to the Board of Adjustment. Because it's kicked up a lot of controversy, or they feel like they're not comfortable. So, yeah.
Oh, no.
I think we're about at our lunch break anyway, so.
I don't know where you are in this, but do you want to, I could talk about this question about the city of Tulsa.
Okay. Oh, yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. We'll take kind of a breather from the procedures. We'll reconvene about procedures, but Susan's going to take a crack at this incog-city relationship, any changes in
Yeah, I'll
what's
get
existing.
started on it, and I'll hand it over to Dawn to clarify. I'm so sorry. Hopefully you can hear me. Okay, I guess I'll kind of start in a very simple form as far as the difference between Land Development Services at INCOG and the City of Tulsa Development Services Division. If your zoning is in place and you don't need any relief from the requirements in the zoning code, then you go to Development Services and you work through the permit process. And even if you get there and they start reviewing your permit, they might find that you do need some relief. They'll write a letter of deficiency, and then you come back to us. So you would deal with us when, if your zoning is not in place, so if you need to rezone your property, if any relief at all is needed in your zoning, if you need any special action from the Board of Adjustment, if you need, if you can't meet the landscaping standards from the Development Services Department, you'll need alternative compliance landscape plan. Also, anything that's a development plan, that process comes through us. So whether it be a PUD, MPD, corridor, or optional development plan, that entire process all the way through, well, through the site plan. Obviously, permitting is never us, but through the site plan comes through INCOG. We also do all subdivision activities. Obviously, that is a bigger activity than just we process on our own, as well as all of them. We get input from the development team at the city. So that's really the simplest way to say it is, if your zoning is in place and you don't need relief, you start at the development services department at the city. If you know that some of that's required, I did want to say, and of course, especially for Board of Adjustment items, things that you need a variance or special exception from, it's usually good to go through the permitting office to get a letter of deficiency from them, because we don't want you to come through us and maybe we aren't looking at things in the exact same way. And when you get your when you go to get your permit, they say, well, there's this other thing too. So we want them to take a look at it, write this letter. You can waive that in most cases. I did want to mention that with administrative adjustments that Kirk just talked about, those small things, that is not, you have to have a letter of deficiency from the City of Tulsa Permit Office. That is not, it's not waivable. And it's really for your protection and your client's protection, because the process isn't going to be streamlined if you keep having to go back and forth and come back to us for more approval. So that's the intent of that. That's sort of the easy explanation. Can you think of anything else, Paul or Dawn?
Well, I guess
Here.
Here, I'll pass them. So the new code talks about, it identifies a land use administrator and a development administrator. And those terms are pretty well indicative of the roles that the city and INCOG play in support of the regulations. So for the purpose of the code, Susan's office is the land use administrator, development services serves as the development administrator. So you'll see those terms throughout the code, and that's really how it's divided up with regard to responsibility and administration. For all intents, and there is a section in this Chapter 70 administration piece about interpretation of the code. As all of you know who've dealt with regulations, you'll never find every answer to every question within the language of the documents. We know that. If it comes to a situation where there may be a section within the code that needs some additional clarification, a particular land use that wasn't considered, technology and other types of changes introduce those new land uses to us all the time. And there may need to be a determination made as to which use category it's appropriately placed in, for instance, or if there's a site-specific issue with regard to how the code is applied to a particular property. An interpretation may be necessary. Those interpretations can come through either the development administrator or the land use administrator. And basically, we work together collaboratively to ensure that we're not going to provide conflicting responses on something like that, that we as a team are all on the same page with regard to application of the code. And the code states ultimately that interpretation comes through my office. And as any action of an administrative official, those interpretations can be appealed to the Board of Adjustment. But that is something that we collaborate on, and it's I think, better defined procedurally in this code than it was previously.
Yeah, I'm glad Don mentioned the interpretations. It is a new formal procedure. I want to make clear, though, that you still can talk to staff, and they'll give you verbal interpretations and readings of what the code is. But if you want a letter to take in writing to your client or investors or bankers, then you'll need to request a formal interpretation. And the process is, today, the interpretation authority, as I read the Blue Code, rests with the Board of Adjustment pretty much solely. And this gives you the opportunity to get a staff level written interpretation. And if you're unhappy with that, or you feel like there's been an error made, you can take that to the Board of Adjustment. So a streamlined process, yet preserving your rights to go to the board. Yes, sir.
So that process would apply to the determination of the applicable use, or what category
If you wanted it in writing, it would apply. If you merely went in and said, here, I've got a permit request, and Paul's office says, well, you don't have the zoning for that because that's this use. That interpretation will stand until you request a written interpretation and then exercise your rights to appeal.
And can that be done in advance of seeking a building permit, for example?
I do. I believe there's no threshold timing determination for when that could be requested. So I'm glad you guys talked about that. Subtle change. Right now, I've talked about the development plans, and that most, if not all, development plans require then a follow-up site plan. I think in the Blue Code, site plans for things like PUDs and corridor zoning under the Blue Code go to the Planning Commission for their determination that, yeah, it's consistent with the development plan, feel free to issue permits. The new code, the Green Code, says that staff can approve that. They can read the development plan and determine that the site plan is or isn't in compliance, and therefore permits can be issued. So we've delegated that authority to staff. Again, always with the right to appeal those administrative decisions. So another potential time-saving step and opportunity to avoid a public hearing or at least a public meeting. There you'll see in the code a written procedure that really, I think, just codifies an existing practice, and that is a spacing and separation distance verification procedure. There are several land uses under the code or circumstances that require some separation from our residential zoning or from another similar use type in the case of some of the more adult-oriented types of uses. And historically, the city has taken those determinations to the Board of Adjustment after public notice to surrounding property owners. And it really wasn't written, at least in my reading, wasn't written down that was a process. So we decided to add that clear indication that those determinations will require that you go through that distance verification process with the Board of Adjustment. And I guess the one other thing, it really has no impact on your lives, but I think just as a reminder to staff, is that the ordinance has minimum public notice requirements for various approvals, often involving mailing to surrounding property owners, posting of signs, and notice in the newspaper. That really constitutes the range of legally required notices under the code historically, and those are all retained. I think we've added a sign posting requirement for development plan amendments. But the point I want to make is that the council was interested in ways to ensure that we take more of an opportunity to notify people. And so there is a section about courtesy public notices in the ordinance that you may run across, and I just wanted to explain to you, is that these are practices that I think the city, the staff, whether INCOG or development services, are doing today in terms of posting things on the website and so forth, that you'll see as new, but they really fall mostly on staff to just do their utmost to get the word out when various types of approvals are required. So that's a summary of what's going on in the procedures chapter. I think a lot of opportunities to get things done a little more quickly at the staff level, and again, always sort of preserving your rights to appeal that up the food chain, as it were.
Thanks for coming back. I'm excited to see the room full again. Okay, so Kirk, we're going to continue the focus topic list, and then once we get about, you can tell, we'll follow the agenda pretty much, and hopefully, again, we get a lot of questions. Once we get past special area overlay, Dwayne and I are going to talk about our procedures and application processes, and then we'll turn it over to Paul and Bob and see if they have anything to add to what they already shared on theirs. So.
Thanks, Susan, and I add my welcome back to you. We will continue to work through our focus topic list. I think the next topic we had intended to explore is uses. I don't know how many of you in the room besides Paul Enix and maybe Janine who had memorized the 26 use units in the Tulsa zoning code, but if you're among that small group, you're going to be a bit disoriented by the way use information is presented in the new zoning code, because we no longer use the use unit terminology. It wasn't necessarily change for change's sake, and we haven't intended to really change, and this goes back to a question I think was asked earlier this morning. Our intention was not to change where uses would be allowed under the code. We took great care in sort of converting the old use unit system to a new use classification system and attempting to ensure that wherever a use unit type under the blue code was allowed in a commercial or residential district, that its equivalent use category or subcategory would be allowed in that same district tomorrow. But suffice to say that when you go to look at the list of allowed land uses in the various zoning districts, you're going to encounter some different terminology than the existing use unit type program that's in place today.
That was in place.
That was in place under the blue code. And by way of explanation, I'm going to try and walk you through the way you should maybe attempt to learn this system or how to navigate your way through this use classification system terminology. As I mentioned earlier today, organizationally, you're going to look in Chapter 35 for a definition of all of the use categories and subcategories and specific use types identified in the zoning code. They're really broken down into about 6 or 7 major groupings. And I think the groupings will be kind of intuitive. There is a group of residential uses and use categories. There is a grouping of public, quasi-public, civic, and institutional type categories. There is, of course, a grouping of what most of us think of as commercial uses, including retail and entertainment and personal service and vehicle type categories and the like. And then in terms of industrial and warehousing type uses, there's a couple categories set aside of the major categories. The wholesale distribution and storage, or is it warehouse distribution and storage category, the industrial, there's a recycling category, and then there's an agricultural category. So what you first want to kind of think of it intuitively is the use that I'm interested in learning more about fall into one of these major groupings. And then from there, it's just kind of a filtering process. Having identified the major category, I then want to see how that use is classified in terms of it fitting within a subcategory. If I was interested in building a hotel, I would know intuitively that's a commercial type land use classification. Once I go down and open up the commercial category, I see that there's a wide variety of subcategories, including one called lodging. And then from there, I see that hotels, motels, bed and breakfast, campgrounds, RV parks, all fall within the lodging category. So it's kind of a matter of kind of filtering your way down through that system. And frankly, some of the groupings of uses aren't dramatically different from the groupings that existed under the use unit of the blue code. So I don't think it's going to be terribly disoriented, but it is different. It's intended to sort of, I think in some respects, it's going to be a little easier to identify because there were a couple of use unit categories that always stymied me because they hid so many uses. There were the first couple of use unit categories for those among us who are real familiar with that system that, you know, were the use categories allowed in all districts. It didn't tell us anything about what kinds of uses that was. It was just, this is a bunch of stuff we allow everywhere, and here's a bunch of stuff we allow everywhere if it's approved by special exception. It didn't give us any sense of what we were going to find once we opened up that box of things. So by putting things in their kind of places in terms of where they fit within a general sense of what we consider to be public uses, institutional uses, commercial, residential, I think it's going to be, at least for first-time and novice users, a little easier to find the use, the information about the use that we're interested in learning more about. The way we created this system is we took a spreadsheet. We took all the uses under the existing zoning code and assigned them to the new categories. And we have a spreadsheet that does that. And maybe at some point and it was pretty current at one point in time. And we converted them to the new use categories and then placed them in the zoning district so that we weren't changing people's lives in terms of what uses were allowed. So I do want you to kind of remember that it's a change in nomenclature and language, but not intended to be a substantive change in terms of where uses are allowed. The one substantive change, I'll get to your question in just a second, sir, is that we've, in sort of refreshing this use, the way we define and categorize land uses, gave us an opportunity to call out some use types that were not addressed in the current code. There may have been some question of interpretation over time about which use unit groupings those existed in. Just a few examples would be alternative fuel vehicle fueling stations, coffee roasting facilities, microbreweries, microdistilleries, kinds of things that are more and more commonplace and just didn't have at least an express home in the existing zoning code. And I think the use categorization system too may provide some better guidance moving forward about how new uses that aren't specifically called out can be categorized in the future through a staff level interpretation. There's some criteria that the staff will use in terms of figuring out where you fall, where your use falls. Your question, sir?
Yes, now that recycling has its own zoning classification, properties that are currently zoned IM and IH, can someone still go under those, or would you have to do a rezoning to do recycling today?
No, there would be no intention that the new recycling category is going to result in any on-the-ground changes in the zoning required for that land use. So it's merely a new name for the use, not a change in the zoning that's required to conduct or operate that type of use. Oh. Okay, so we've learned a little bit about the use categories. Let's talk a bit about, I mentioned earlier this morning that one of the big ideas that underlies the zoning is to ensure that we have a rich sort of variety of residential housing options for folks, and to maybe fill in some of the, in planning speak, it's called the missing middle housing. And it refers to the fact that older zoning ordinances do a really good job of defining single-family uses and multifamily uses, and the gulf in between is often quite large. And sometimes what people want to do is not exactly single-family and not the full-on multifamily huge apartment complex that sometimes strikes fears in neighbors' hearts. And by better defining those missing middle categories, we can provide for more subtle variations in housing types and make it easier to sort of introduce a little bit more housing choice and variety within both existing neighborhoods and certainly in newly developing areas of the city. So the first thing I'll draw your attention to is the creation of a new residential zoning classification that essentially is a small lot single family classification that also allows some of these missing middle housing types that I referred to earlier. So it allows detached houses on lots as small as 3,300 square feet in area, far smaller than the, what is the R4, the 5,000?
Yeah, 5,500.
5,500. So quite a reduction in allowed minimum lot size with this new R5 zoning that would be available for future rezoning requests. As with all the new zoning classifications, it's not on the map sort of automatically by any means, but would be available for future rezonings, whether initiated by the subject property owner or maybe because of some planning initiative by the city itself. It would allow detached houses, townhouses, 2-unit houses, and small kind of flat style apartments, 3-4 unit, multi-unit house type buildings. Go by a variety of names, stacked flats, big houses, multi-unit houses, and the like. And all have their own kind of standards associated with what the lot requirements are for those various housing types. So when it comes to the building types, which is where I started this discussion, you see, for those of you who can see our new fangled slide display, the left-hand column under the blue code shows the housing types that are expressly called out in the code as allowed in one or more of the zoning district. And the right-hand side shows the new expanded list of building and housing types that would be available under the code. And as you can see, we've added patio houses, cottage houses or cottage courts, courtyard housing, it goes by a variety of names. The small multi-unit buildings that we call multi-unit houses, and then mixed-use buildings where residential units are above the ground floor of commercial or other uses that exist on the ground floor. So expanded that range of building types fairly considerably. Now the patio house is allowed first in the RS3 district. So here would be an example where, as of right, there would be a way to do a little bit subtly different type of housing in an existing district without going through the rezoning process. Because there's, as you're well aware, those of you who know residential zoning, RS3 is a pretty common zoning classification in the city. Some of the other options first become available in the new district as a way to not introduce tremendous change or perceived change into existing neighborhoods. So some of them will require rezoning, but at least that patio house option would be available even under a couple of the existing classifications, RS3, RS4, and the like. The patio house is, in some parts of the world, it's called the zero lot line type housing arrangement. It's not an attached style. These are detached units, but they're shifted to one side of the lot. Particularly appropriate in a smaller lot setting where the side setbacks are minimal, and that if you situated the building right in the middle of the lot between the two side lot lines, you'd be left with side yard setbacks that are barely able to navigate with your lawnmower or to walk behind. So by shifting the house to one side of the lot, you provide a more usable side yard on the other side of the lot, and for folks who are walking or driving down the street, it's imperceptible because the houses are still separated by that minimum distance that they would have gotten if each house had its side yard adjacent to the other. This again is a housing option that would have been available heretofore by variance, maybe through a planned unit development process, but for the first time we have standards as of right in the ordinance that would allow this to occur. There are some rules, with regard to doing it in an infill setting, so that you don't put a zero side next to a conventionally situated house that didn't develop under that zero lot line or patio house development.
Paul, that's going to require the on average yard separation on that one wall, no penetration.
Yeah, let's go back to the building code requirements.
Did you all hear that question? The question was, will the building code requirements with regard to firewalls and those types of requirements apply to that zero side if it's on the lot line?
It will not apply on that zero lot line side. because you have the requirement here that makes that a no-build zone on the other side of the line. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You might use your microphone.
When you have the zero lot line, the wall that's on the lot line is not required to be rated because you have in the zoning code the requirement that doesn't allow you to do any building on the other side of the line. So it'll meet code because it's a no-build area without the fire resistance rating.
Good. That's a good answer. I'm glad that was the answer. So the small lot residential district I mentioned is the first time that some of these new building types are allowed as of right. One being the cottage court, and that's what I have an example of here. I think I've got, yeah. The cottage house style development is a fairly unique infill tool. It really took hold in the U.S. in the Pacific Northwest, at least in modern times. I think historically it might have been more prevalent, maybe before zoning, but in a sort of modern zoning era, this became fairly popular in the Washington, Oregon, Californias of the world, and has kind of spread throughout the city. Sometimes they're referred to as pocket neighborhoods, cottage courts. We call them cottage house developments, but they're basically, the essence of it is that they're fairly small or typically smaller dwelling units clustered around a common open area, a courtyard. A small open space area. So it's going to be a larger parcel, maybe not a standard single-family lot, but there are instances where you're able to maybe have a deeper lot, where this might be a viable option for somebody who wants to sort of keep the rhythm of the street in place by having a couple of dwelling units on the street and then tucking a few in behind, clustered around this open space area. So that's the idea behind this, and as I say, it's allowed in that new RS5 zoning classification. And it does come with some supplemental standards in terms of the minimum area that's required, the amount of open space that needs to constitute that common open area, and I think even the size of the dwelling units is limited to some extent. The multi-unit house concept is, this is applicable in a couple of ways. One, oftentimes in older neighborhoods, there are really large houses that maybe the property owner that's historically owned the house, not historic in the sense of a district, is maybe unable, unwilling, or doesn't want to maintain such a large house anymore. Could it be divided up into multiple units, or could we introduce brand new construction into a residential setting that looks more like a house but has multiple units in it? And so this multi-unit house concept is that tool. Again, it's limited to certain zoning classifications. It wouldn't be an as-of-right option in a lot of the single-family districts, but it is an option going forward in the new districts and in the multifamily districts. The mixed-use districts. One of the real strong concepts that's emphasized by the comprehensive plan, it's a really strong theme, is the idea of creating greater opportunities for mixed use within the city, particularly in older neighborhood areas. The ability for people to sort of be able to live and maybe even work, but certainly to shop and have access to entertainment within a short, within walking distance, or maybe sometimes a short drive from their home, needs to be nurtured more by zoning and not focus so much on separating things that historically zoning tried to keep apart. So these new mixed-use districts are kind of an attempt to really encapsulate some of those concepts. They're rather unique. They're certainly different than the other zoning districts in that they're not kind of pre-assembled into the R3, CH, CS variety, but you sort of, these zoning districts are made up of kind of component parts. There's a use part of the zoning classification, there's a physical character component, and then there's a building height component. And a property owner who is interested in obtaining this sort of zoning for their property in the future would say, well, I'm looking for a neighborhood mixed-use classification that is that fits within the urban character context and allows buildings up to 45 feet in height. And they would put that together into a mixed-use district called MX1U45. And by combining these pieces, zoning district pieces in various ways, there's zoning available through this mixed-use option that would really accommodate a really wide variety of different styles of mixed-use different districts and building types. Each of the character designations, you see there's a pedestrian character designation, there's an urban character designation, and these sort of go from levels of walkability, with the pedestrian character designator being the most walkable, ensures the greatest level of activity at the street level, buildings adjacent to the sidewalk that have a lot of ground floor transparency, that have doors and windows facing the street, have the parking hid behind the building and the like. And as we go up from that very pedestrian-oriented character designation, the next one is called urban, which is a little less rigorous in terms of that level of walkability and pedestrian scale. We have a variable character designator, and then one that's flexible, highly flexible, and even allows single-family detached uses. It would apply more of a neighborhood type setting. And then the height designators range from a very neighborhood-oriented 35 feet up to unlimited building height if one obtains the unlimited height designator in their mixed-use classification. All the character designators have building types associated with them in terms of what's allowed. The highly pedestrian or walkable one allows only mixed-use buildings, and those are the buildings with the highest level of sort of ground floor activation in terms of doors and windows. It also allows public and civic building types, say a library or some kind of public utility type building that can't meet the mixed-use standards. But for private development, the pedestrian one is the most restrictive and allows only the mixed-use buildings. The urban, variable, and flexible allow far broader range of building types. Each of the character designations and building types have different standards associated with them. The standards address the location of the building on the lot relative to the street building line, the sidewalk. Have standards related to where the parking can be located. The amount of transparency, particularly on the ground floor, the percentage of the street-facing wall that's made up of transparent doors and windows. It even addresses ground floor building height for new construction in an effort, at least within the mixed-use building concept, to ensure that space is usable for a whole range of active kind of pedestrian-oriented mixed use. Now, a lot of these physical standards, the build two-line standard, the ground floor building height standard, the ordinance makes clear that those only apply to new construction. It could be the case that a mixed-use district has existing buildings in it, and they would be exempt from compliance with standards that they simply can't comply with. They can't move where the building is or rearrange the floor-to-ceiling heights of the various floors of the building. So these new, more urban-oriented, walkable mixed-use standards apply to the new buildings. Yes, sir?
Does this replace form-based code here in Tulsa?
Well, that's a kind of has a lot of ways to answer it. I would say that it is an alternative that I think will accomplish many of the objectives of form-based coding.
That's why I asked. It appears to be redundant.
It addresses a lot of the physical, context-sensitive, walkable urban character issues that the form-based code is designed to address. I don't know that it's going to receive any accolades from the Form-Based Code Institute or gain any or win any awards from them, but it is more towards a form-based approach to zoning, emphasizing more the physical form and physical character of development rather than the individual uses. One of the real advantages of this mixed-use classifications for folks who are interested in doing mixed-use buildings, particularly buildings with residential in them, is that there are no density limits within these buildings. There is no minimum land area per dwelling unit requirement. What you can fit within the box in terms of the allowed building height and the building footprint is what would be allowed as your residential yield. So I think it offers some real flexibility that doesn't exist in some of the conventional zoning classifications that are more focused on density, per se. Another way that focuses on form rather than sometimes hard to understand concepts like density and floor area ratio and like that, which aren't regulated in the MX districts. What's it doing? The MX districts are the only districts, I believe, under the Green Code that have a transitional height plane requirement that basically says, because the districts allow the unlimited building height or the 55, 65-foot high, tall buildings, there is a requirement where the typical scenario would be that along a corridor you abut to the rear of single-family residential zoning, that the tallest portions of the building be stepped back. And we've tested this on a variety of sites and think that even meeting these transitional height plane requirements, these sites would be highly developable under this mixed option, but it is something that you'll see as you look at these MX districts.
One thing, this may be obvious, but I just want to say it anyway. One thing about the mixed-use districts is that it is a base zoning district. So it is not something that you have to come through INCOG for site plan approval. It is a base zoning district, so when you're ready to move forward with developing in that district, you just go straight for your permit. So just to clarify, it is supposed to be there's supposed to be an ease to this district and of course developing it. So I wanted to mention that.
Good, that's a good point. Once it's in place, no development plans, no site plan review, no discretionary approvals after that point, unless your use happens to be a special exception or you're requesting relief from one of the new standards. Yeah.
Is there a plan for when that might be changed on the zoning map?
Here. Well, this is a district that someone would have to apply for. So I guess. Right, and I guess let me just, I don't know if this is the time, but since there was a question about form-based code, I'll go ahead and talk about, let me go ahead and do that for me.
Sure.
Okay, form-based code was, concurrently with the adoption of this code, it was repealed. So this code actually specifically changes what was designated FBC on the zoning map to MPD FBC 1. So it is a master plan development, which Kirk's getting ready to talk about that in a minute, I think. That's the sort of the replacement that we have for PUD. So to just take that a little further, that's, MPD FBC 1. If someone else came forward and said, I don't really want to do mixed use, I want to do some of these other things, but I really like the form-based code, they could actually take what was the form-based code, look at the other MPD, and even alter it somewhat, and that could be MPD FBC 2. So, that form-based code can still resurface in different places in the city if people want to use it. It's just in the form of a master plan development.
which is a good segue to our next topic, which is master plan development. The master plan development tool is an important one, and I guess one way to look at it is that it is the replacement for the highly flexible tool that existed under the blue zoning code called PUD, Planned Unit Development. Under the new zoning code, there will be no more new PUDs approved. The option for a property owner who has determined that their proposed development cannot be accommodated under any of the old blue code tools or any of the new code tools or any of the options that we've talked about today. The option for those folks will be to request approval of a master plan development. Master plan developments differ from PUDs in subtle and important ways. Importantly, the MPD district is a base zoning classification. Once it's approved for a property, it becomes that property's zoning. Those who are familiar with the PUD tool know that that's kind of the case with the PUD, but there's still underlying zoning in place when you get when you've got a PUD approved under the blue code. The property could have one or more base zoning classification and a PUD overlay approved on top of it, which changes dramatically or subtly what the underlying zoning allows. It's been our determination in Tulsa and in many other places we've worked that the overlay style zoning causes confusion for folks who are not immersed in the world of zoning very deeply. They'll look at a zoning map and maybe they'll see the PUD designator, maybe they'll see some indication that something's different, but what they focus in on is the RS3 that they see on the zoning map. And that when things start to happen, that is at odds with what they expect to see based on that base zoning designation, the phone starts ringing and they get very sort of concerned about not knowing that something was going to happen near them or in an area where they commonly travel. So the base zoning, I think, will provide a clear indication for folks that this site is unique, it has unique zoning, and you better, if you're interested, if you're doing your due diligence or finding out about it, you need to make some calls, or I think eventually there'll be a point in time where it's a click on the zoning map and you'll be able to pull up exactly what that MPD means. But MPD will mean something very unique to that property that you'll need to research. Now that's the case with PUDs today, but again, it's sometimes not as clear to folks who aren't familiar with that. So it's a base zoning classification. The ordinance language that describes the purpose and intended application of the MPD also makes clear that it's intended for unique situations, and that in exchange for because it's a base zoning district, what we're essentially saying to property owners is, write your own zoning for this property. Take a look at what the comprehensive plan says and your own development plans. Come up with a set of regulations that will meet both of those objectives and present it to the city in the form of a development plan and go through the same process that you would have gone through for the PUD. But before you do that, make clear that why it is you need to use it in terms of the unique nature of the project, why you couldn't have done this some other way, and describe what the benefits are to this highly flexible tool that you're proposing in terms of public benefits. There will obviously be some benefits or some motivation for the private property owner, and that's all well and good, but to describe too why this kind of a quid pro quo. We're going to allow a high degree of flexibility, but there's certainly going to be some sort of public gain as well, whether it's in terms of market or economic opportunity or environmental or whatever the case. That needs to be a part of the justification for the project, the flexibility in exchange for the public benefits. The process is, I think, pretty much identical to the PUD process. Beyond that, zoning map amendment accompanied by a mandatory development plan. Once that's approved, site plan, which I mentioned this morning, can be approved administratively, and then permits. based on the site plan. As I say, the development plan isn't tied to base zoning anymore. It'll need to address, I mean, you could in fact come in with the development plan that says we're requesting the existing, or the, essentially the CH district with these modifications. So you can start with a base district if you'd like, but it needs to address all the aspects that are going to control your property in terms of use and the development standards, the lot and building regulations and the like. Now, existing PUDs don't go away by any means. They live on. They are given their own special home within the new green zoning code. It's called the legacy chapter, which means they have status. While no new PUDs will be approved and no expansions of boundaries or existing PUDs approved, the process for an amending existing PUD will essentially remain the same as it is today. And you will be able to amend those in terms of what the development plan says. It's just that we're not going to apply any new PUD zoning or any expansions of PUD zoning to the zoning map. Correct?
Will we still need to do detailed site plans and landscape plans?
Yes.
For the MPD? Yeah.
Or
for existing, yeah. Yeah. You still need to do the detailed site plans, including the landscape plans, either for new MPDs or amendments to existing the legacy PUDs. Okay. Any questions about master plan developments as a new alternative? Go ahead.
I've noticed changes in the corridor district, that there are not the same type of requirements in order to qualify for a corridor district as there is or was in the previous code. Would a master plan development or one of those forms be more appropriate today, staff's opinion, in the corridor district, or would it be more, I guess, more flexible perhaps with the land?
So we eliminated all the standards.
Well, I'm going to have to look this up. I know that we did change the purpose and intent on the corridor district just because, at one point we were questioning what's the difference between MPD and corridor. So I'd have to look those up to remind myself. But, the corridor district was established for a purpose, to allow for a lot of interconnections on major thoroughfares, from property to property, and keep the traffic off of that major thoroughfare, whatever it is, 71st Street, the highway, whatever. So we really tried to beef up that purpose of the corridor district. What we think as staff, that the MPD, we really want to have discussions with people to where this does not come the default. There's going to be a higher standard to even use an MPD. There is a public benefit aspect to it. We have a lot of other options here that can get you to places that we've seen previous PUDs, like smaller lot sizes, so there's a lot of mixed use districts, so there's a lot of other choices besides that. I don't know if I answered your question, but anyway, so I think corridor and MPD, they're very similar. As you know, we have a lot of corridor that doesn't have a corridor development plan yet. So I'm not sure how many new corridor districts.
I like the new corridor districts, because the problem limiting the prior corridor district when we don't see development plans was the requirement that it had to have all of the lots and development had to have primary access on an internal collector street. And the result of that created a lot of problems, where you're trying to limit access onto the arterial street, but you didn't have access because there were no service roads built on the expressways and stuff, which would have served the corridor districts if there had ever been service roads built in Oklahoma and Tulsa. So I like the new district, and I think it provides you better flexibility and design in corridor zone properties than what you had previously.
I think one other thing that I'll just point out, since we're sort of talking about all that, is that both of those zoning classifications, corridor and NPD, they have both have a required development plan that goes with them. So in that instance, that is kind of the process and the thought process that goes with it is the same. But the NPD doesn't have that overlying concept of an internal circulation system that corridor might have.
I like it.
Yeah.
The other change that you'll see in the corridor is that some of the lot and building regulations that were attached to that district were eliminated. And those issues will need to be addressed as part of the development plan, but no longer does the...
30% building.
Yeah, yes, we've eliminated those requirements. Now, you may still be asked, as part of the approval process, questions about the level of intensity and access control and the like, as good planners would prone to ask, but no longer will the code be the sole reason that you're limited in any of those regards. So that's a good question, a good reminder that the elimination of those standards in corridor. Thank you for that. I want to make a point about optional development plans that I forgot to make this morning. I talked about that with great enthusiasm, that we have these mandatory development plans that go along with the corridor and the MPD, but there's also the new option of including a development plan with any rezoning. The one thing I forgot to stress is those development plans are slightly different. The optional development plans are slightly different than the mandatory development plans that need to come with corridor and MPD zoning. Those development plans are highly flexible. You know, you can propose what you'd like, and what you get approved is what you get approved. An optional development plan can't be used in the same way. You can't use an optional development plan with RS3 to propose an office building in a single-family zoning district. Those optional development plans can merely be used to fine-tune or to place additional restrictions voluntarily on your property, not to get the level of flexibility that we've historically been able to get through the corridor plan or whatever. So I just want to make that point clear. Go ahead.
That sounds like almost conditional zoning, where if I was doing a conditional zoning application and there was some concern we couldn't address previously, except by doing a plan unit development that allowed the council and commission to impose specific conditions on the zoning. So would that now enable us to do that by using the optional development to impose those site-specific conditions that might eliminate protests, for example?
Yes, a very, very good description of how we expect that it's likely to the extent that it's used in the future. I think it'll be used in exactly that way. All right.
One of the things that we talked about in the hallway or somewhere is the Vulcan area requirements and how we could manipulate those inside an optional development plan. It's my understanding that, and I'm not sure I have this exactly right, but in an optional development plan, the way I see it right now is that you could not, for instance, if there's a 25-foot building setback, you could not make that a 15-foot setback, but you could make it a 30-foot setback. So but the general idea is for you to self-regulate beyond what the base zoning is. And that's in Vulcan area requirements, any of the dimensional things, or uses, any of that kind of stuff. I guess parking would apply there. You couldn't lighten your parking requirement also.
That's correct. You couldn't reduce your parking through the optional development plan. So this morning when I was talking in broad themes about what we're going to be talking about today, I sort of couched master plan developments under the term customization tools. And the next one I'm going to talk to you about is also under the customization heading, and that's called the special area overlay. Something we talked quite a bit about during the zoning code update and went through various iterations of this overlay tool before we latched on something that elected and appointed officials felt comfortable with. I want to make clear, like I've said a few times today, this is a new zoning classification. It happens to be an overlay zoning classification, but it's nothing by way of the provisions in the code is going to put this on the zoning map until subject property owners, the owners of that property or the city decides to apply one of these things. It is essentially just enabling authority, clear indication in the zoning code that it is possible to craft a neighborhood or area-specific overlay for multiple properties to do special things. And the range of special things is pretty broad and is limited only by the imagination in most respects. One thing that I want to emphasize about this type of overlay is sometimes when we hear about overlay, we think only about additional regulations, more restrictive standards. And that's in fact one of the possibilities of the use of this overlay, but it can also be used to relax standards of the base district. So it's merely a supplemental district that can be combined with the base zoning to modify what's allowed within the underlying zoning. There's a couple of general points of guidance about how the overlay can be used. One is kind of applies to all things in the zoning code, is it can't be used in ways that are inconsistent with the comprehensive plan. And it also can't be used to subject all future development to some kind of discretionary review process, like a design review process. It's not necessarily intended to be, one of the early sort of critiques is, oh, well, this just kind of sounds like historic preservation light. And while it's possible that the special area overlay could be used to address design type considerations, it's not intended that it be a replacement tool or a companion tool for historic preservation and require that all future projects go through a case-by-case review to see if we like your paint color or your roof pitch. If you can write objective standards into the ordinance, you can use it as an overlay. So it can't be used in that way. That's not to impugn the value of HP zoning. It's just saying that this one is not that. It's not that in particular. It does also require a minimum area before it could be applied. It's got to meet two criteria. There have to be at least 10 lots, and those 10 lots have to equal a land area of at least an acre. So it's not a huge threshold, a real high bar, but it isn't intended to be used, for each individual lot within an area. So, and it's established following the usual rezoning procedures. It's a rezoning, plain and simple. And going back to one of the questions that we had this morning, and a question we get a lot is, well, who applies this? Who applies this? And the answer is always the same. The subject property owners can band together and file an application. They can have a pre-application conference over at INCOG and talk about their plans, and INCOG can tell them what's in store and ask them what they have in mind in terms of their restrictions and standards, but then they'll go through a standard rezoning process. Or the city, maybe as a result of a small area planning effort or a neighborhood planning effort, could decide to initiate this on behalf of folks as well. But those are the two ways, city initiated or by the owners of the subject property, not by the neighbors of the subject property.
Okay, do you want me to go ahead and move into my statement?
Yeah.
Because I will add on to this,
Please.
which I was going to do later, but it
Please.
kind of makes sense to do it now since we were just talking about special area overlays. Okay, and I did want to add to this that there's also a significant section, it's actually in the overlay chapter and applies to all overlays or potential overlays, about quite a robust public process that has to take place as well, and those reporting sort of requirements to what that public process look like as it goes through the public hearing process. So this was added during probably the final part of this, just to ensure that there would be some significant discussion with all property owners, and all that would be reported to the decision makers when it went through final approval process. So there was that. As far as what I want to talk about is our policies and procedures and things that have changed. On special area overlay, we do have an application. It's actually the same application form. Today, all our new applications are supposed to be put online, so hopefully they are by the end of the day. And it's the same application form as the MPD and the PUD and the corridor, and you can see it's special area overlay box you check. And then there's a statement that you need to submit that talks about how it meets the requirements of the code. So that's specifically laid out in the application that mirrors the language in the code about, why can't you achieve what you're trying to achieve in this special area overlay through other zoning districts. And then the 3 points in the code that talk about, what's your purpose. Is it try to protect a unique development, blah, 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 promote investment, or help implement neighborhood plans. So there's more language to that, but that's the general summary of that. So we'll want that. But even before, of course, for something this, that could be this significant, we definitely, and with all applications, we appreciate pre-application discussions. So, I mean, this is, unless something is going to come out and prove me wrong, I do think a special area overlay application, it's not an MPD. It's not something that if you submit it by this date, we can get you to Planning Commission on this date. I mean, we're going to have to, this is language that will be added to Chapter 20 of this code. So this is more of a, serious, I guess, we need to make sure we get it right. We're working with multiple property owners. It's not just one property owner. Staff's heavily involved, obviously property owners, whoever the applicant or representative is. So it's a longer process. So as soon as we have a pre-application and we get an application, we'll try to put together a feasible timeline for us to work through that process. But it's definitely won't meet the submittal requirements and timelines that we usually see for an MPD. It's just to more a significant type of application and scope of geography there. So that's what I think I wanted to say about that. So yeah, in the end, it results in both a map amendment and a text amendment. So it's also a little bit more complex in how it's the changes that have to result. Okay, one thing I wanted to talk about, I told you about the new forms online. We also have a new fee schedule, and this was approved by Planning Commission and then City Council last Thursday night. And you won't see a big change in the numbers that you pay and the cost, but it's different. And one thing that's really different is just the methodology on how we're charging fees. We used to have a sliding scale that was based on the intensity and the size. I never understood that, at least since I've been here for 3 years, because that doesn't correlate to the complexity of the project. We have some really complex projects on little tiny pieces. So I just didn't see how that made any sense. So we did a little research on average cost, and now there's a flat fee. So it'll be a little easier for you as you're trying to figure out whatever that application cost is. Again, I doubt anyone will see any increases. In fact, I would think that you may see some decreases in some of your larger projects, the cost. We added all of the different application types on here. There might be a couple of things might be a $50 difference, but otherwise it's really pretty much the same. I did want to talk about a second, and I know you've probably heard some of this, but I'll go ahead and say again. We have the new blue schedule out. On this, I know this is the submittal schedule for 2016. We do have, I have a little sentence here that says staff will determine the schedule for special area overlay applications as they are submitted. So that's just something that we'll work on with you when and if that happens. Of course, we've talked, you've already heard that site plans for PUDs, MPDs, corridors, those no longer go to Planning Commission. So those are really just like landscape plans and sign plans as far as submittal requirements. Timelines. They're not attached to a Planning Commission meeting anymore, as well as alternative compliance landscape plans. And then the same holds true, which this is a little boo-boo on the back, but it does say on the Board of Adjustment side that minor variance and minor special exception applications, anyway, ignore that. There's really not that anymore. It's really administrative adjustments. We're calling those things now. Those don't go to the board anymore. Of course, they're not subject to those deadlines because they don't go to the board anymore. So just ignore that line. I know I'm jumping all over a little bit, but what I did want to say about administrative adjustments for the Board of Adjustment is that we do have a process that we wrote up for that and have thought through it. We have Nikita Moye. She's our board administrator, very thoughtful and ready for this process. So she will try, once you submit these administrative adjustments to her, and remember, a letter of deficiency is required for those. And once she, knows exactly what your relief is, she will really kind of do the normal work she does. She'll probably go out and visit the site. After we notify abutting property owners, she'll wait 15 days after that to make sure that we get any feedback we're going to get before she issues the letter of approval for that administrative adjustment. So that's kind of the timing you're looking at there. It might be a month or 3 weeks or however long it takes us to do that. So hopefully we'll get it done quickly, but we do need to wait for feedback from the neighbors that we are contacting. Okay, let's see. One other thing I want to talk about before I want to give this over to Dwayne. Let's see. I just wanted to talk about how our zoning map might look different. We've talked about some new categories. Obviously, that's a no-brainer. You'll see RS5s maybe over time. The mixed-use districts, we'll see maybe MX1-P-45. That'll be the zoning district that's on the zoning map. As far as a couple things we're doing different. This year, when corridor development plans, we are now preparing ordinances for corridor development plans. So right now, I don't know how this evolved over time, but on the map, it just shows that it's corridor zoning. You don't know if it has a development plan associated with it or not. So now we are going to mark CO1, CO2, whatever, on the map as those come in. MPDs will be the same. The first MPD will be MPD1. Second will be MPD2. As far as the optional development plans, you'll want to know, and we want to know, when there is an optional development plan associated with the property. And as you picture the zoning map now, and it has the blue dotted line around the property with the PUD number on it, we're going to, whatever that zoning district is, RS3, and we'll put Z8520, or whatever the zoning case number is, so that you'll know if that zoning case number is on there, which is not on any other part of the map, that will signify that for that straight zoning district, there is an optional development plan. That's the case number. You can easily come and check it out in our office, and hopefully in time, all that will be hyperlinked to the map, and you can just look and pull everything up. That's obviously our goal. We're not really there yet, but okay, those are the things I want to say, and I think Dwayne wants to talk more about submittal requirements.
Yeah, really, there's not much to add to that, except that generally our submittal requirements, our goal is to reduce the paper that comes to us with that. We'll probably, I think in every development plan and every PUD and NPDs and corridor plans, all of that stuff, we're going to whittle that down to basically having 2 copies in a paper version, and then we'll be asking for a PDF file of whatever the application is. On some of these items, especially if there's a lot of text to it, we're going to want that in some kind of a Word document so we can include that in our staff report and manipulate it as we go back and forth. But generally, the idea is to reduce the amount of paper that comes through our office. I think that this is getting way down into the weeds, but on all of our plans, including site plans and landscape plans, sign plans, all those kind of things, we are still going to send you a stamped approved plan I'm assuming that it's always going to be approved, but we'll eventually get to an approved plan, and then you'll have to take that to Paul's office as part of your building permit package and sort that through the building permit process. but I think the big difference that you'll see from us is that we won't be needing, you know, a lot of copies, and we've kind of implemented that process already, but it just hadn't really been documented. But I think that you'll see less and less paper coming to us as you actually make your application. Just one of the little details that we'll struggle with for a while, I think, is we will probably not want to see scanned copies. We'll want to see a PDF that's created from an original file. That way, when you zoom in on it real tight, you can see everything that you need to see. But that's something that will evolve a little bit over time on how we can actually enforce that. But I think that you know, from those perspectives, that's the main thing that you'll see a difference in.
Now, for submittals to development services for your permit, I've kind of inserted some comments as we've gone along this morning. Just to get you on board with thinking of things just a little bit differently based on the new requirements, although our whole goal is to keep your experience just as similar as possible tomorrow as it was last year. There will be a few, probably we'll make some changes in looking at the submittal forms, not too much to do there. A couple of items we may add there as we look those over. The main thing to keep in mind is, as we've looked at landscape and screening plans, the lighting plans that go with the parking lot plans. As far as the parking, we spent a lot of time talking about those for the obvious reason that there are a lot of changes there. We will ask you to identify which method that you're using when you determine how many parking places you're going to provide, because there's several different ways to look at it. We'd like to have that information. Basically a parking analysis, which we already asked for a parking analysis so you can see how you calculate your number of parking spaces. But it's the same thing, but you'll be using a different method. You'll have to select which method you're going to use first. And of course include that pedestrian circulation plan on your site plan. Did you have a question?
Is that on provided parking or is that required?
All parking. One of the things, an accessory use we didn't mention yet, it's something new, so I wanted to put it in your brain to take a look at it. If it's straight zoning, if it's not going to incog, so if it's straight zoning, is dumpsters. They're now required to be screened. Required to have something in writing from the owner that they can be placed where they are. Anyway, you've been doing that already when you take something to incog, if it's in a PUD. We usually have that in the development standards, for example. But for straight zoning, we're not. It wasn't required. Now it is. So just use that same expertise you were using before and put it in the straight zoning plans as well. But that's something new, and that's why I wanted to bring it up. Any questions?
Does that include grease traps?
Are you talking about the building code requirements or plumbing code requirements?
I have to provide a dumpster closure. Does the grease trap have to be in a grease?
There,
You're going to restaurant.
there are a couple of options. You probably ought to call Tyler Carter and discuss those options with him. I can give you his number afterwards if you don't have it.
Back to the agenda. Okay, so let's continue with a few more topics that I think are worthy of a discussion, just in terms of identifying new or revised provisions. The next section I want to go over pertains to accessory uses. And by and large, I kind of like Paul's language about being as least disruptive as possible in terms of change. I don't think we're going to notice a tremendous amount of change accessory uses and structures chapter, which is chapter 45. But there are a few new features or clarifying provisions added to that section. We address specifically some things that are not addressed under existing, or the old code. That would include things like electric vehicle charging stations that we sometimes see at new, shopping centers and grocery stores and drugstores and the like. Clarifying just how those are treated. If I reserve a spot in the parking lot for vehicle charging equipment, can I count that parking space towards my minimum parking requirements? The answer is yes. And it also addresses, this being Oklahoma, alternative fuels other than electricity. CNG refueling appliances, even as an accessory use in a residential setting, are expressly allowed, as are such sustainable development practices as geothermal heat pumps and geothermal heating systems, solar panels, even small wind energy systems are addressed specifically in the new zoning code for the first time. So there will be less of an instance where somebody proposing to make use of a green or sustainable technology will sort of have to work with development services to make up the rules for the first time, but rather have some initial guidance going in about which of these kinds of alternative energy technologies or the like are permitted. And by and large, the code takes a very accommodating approach towards accommodating all those sorts of things, including like the location of rain barrels in yards and so forth. So those are some of the kind of new features. Paul mentioned the requirement for screening dumpsters, dumpster enclosures being a new sort of requirement for some types of permit applications under the new code. That really stems from our attempt to address an issue that emerged pretty late in the process. There was a small contingent who were very concerned about the proliferation of donation drop boxes, or I can't remember what the ordinance calls them. Recyclable material bins is the code terminology for those kinds of boxes that you see in sometimes older shopping centers or part of gas station where you're supposed to go and drop off your old clothes or books or some kind of consumable material to be collected by somebody and sent off to do good for somebody. And the location, the appearance, the upkeep, the maintenance of that had become a concern, as I said, for some. That was identified late in the process. In our attempts to address that, we discovered that we needed to, from a legal standpoint, we really needed to treat those types of facilities the same as we treat all types of facilities where we deposit stuff. Whether it's garbage or recyclable material, then we need to sort of be equal in our treatment. So having come to that conclusion, we proposed and was adopted, it was adopted as part of the new zoning code, that both dumpsters and recyclable material bins in the future will need to be screened from view of streets and residential zoning districts, I believe is the way the language reads. And moreover, existing recyclable material bins, I believe, will need to be brought into compliance with that standard within about a year and a half. November 2017 is the date. Yeah. So that's new. It's in the accessory use chapter. It's maybe more of a story than you wanted to hear. Home occupations, another part of the accessory use chapter, since home occupations are technically an accessory use of a residential dwelling for something other than living and sleeping and eating. But for work-related activities, the home occupation chapter has been modernized, the section, rather, has been modernized to be a little more flexible than today's zoning code. We've identified two types of home occupation, given them the clever name of type 1 and 2. Type 1 being one that has no additional employees that come from other than the residents to work at that house, and that have no customer visits associated with it. It's merely any of us as a professional working from home. Something that obviously has little, if any, impacts on the surrounding area. And then there's the type 2, which might involve a non-resident employee or some small number of customer visits or deliveries associated with my home occupation. Those type 2 require special exception approval. The type 1, which are really the way the blue code was written before, are allowed as of right, obviously, since this is such a commonplace occurrence. There are other regulations in the home occupation section of the ordinance designed merely to give the city some basis for encouraging property owners who engage in home occupations to be as sensitive to the neighborhood setting as possible. So some modernization there in the home occupation provisions, which are found in section 45-100 of the new Green Zoning Code. Following Chapter 45, which is the accessory uses and structures chapter, is the temporary uses provision. This is something that most developers and property owners would have very little, reason to use this chapter, but it does include kind of a new approach for accommodating a theme that's been strong throughout today's program to allow more kinds of temporary uses and activities to be approved administratively rather than always involving a trip to the zoning board of adjustment or the planning commission or city council. So that's the main takeaway from the temporary use chapter, is that low impact, short-term temporary uses can be approved administratively if it involves the use of public land or there's some temporary use standard that can't be met by the applicant for the temporary use. Then additional public review would be required, either in terms of the Board of Adjustment or, if it's public land, might even be the City Council for those events of public interest or what they're called. And some limitation on the number of yard and garage sales is even added to that chapter to address, again, like the recyclable material bans, kind of a continuing kind of maintenance or neighborhood disruption for some folks in the community. So that's the accessory use and temporary use chapter. The definitions and measurements, those are the final two chapters, you may remember. Measurements is actually before definitions, measurements being chapter 90 and definitions being 95. The measurements chapter, chapter 90, consolidates in one place all of the, under the new code's organizational discipline, all those measurement-related provisions are found in that section. Including how we measure everything from the area of a lot to its width to the setback. It includes some exceptions to generally applicable rules, like the ability to, where the existing pattern of setbacks on a given street is at odds with what the zoning says. Maybe it's an older area that was developed pre-zoning and the houses are all closer to the street than what the ordinance requires. It would allow staff to sort of take that into account and approve a contextual setback in that case without going for a Board of Adjustment approval. So contextual setbacks, some clarification of the types of things that can encroach or obstruct a required building setback. What kinds of things can be in the yard? As we all know, zoning, particularly in the residential setting, says buildings have to be so far from the street, so far from the rear property line, sides and the like. But there are all sorts of things. Garden-type facilities, patios, decks, porches, bay windows that have historically been allowed to exist within those areas. And we've taken the opportunity to sort of modernize that list to address things like rain barrels and alternative energy type equipment like geothermal heat pumps and solar panels to provide for some greater flexibility there. We even go so far as to clarify that you can use a green roof to satisfy your minimum open space requirements on a lot. at least some portion of that.
What is a green roof?
A green roof under the definition of the code is one that's vegetated. So I think there is a more precise definition than that, but that is what a green roof is.
Cash crops.
And it's, the advantages of the green roof in terms of the environment is that it has some ability to retain water, at least for a while, in place before being more slowly released, and it can reduce heating effects of buildings and provide some energy efficiencies for the building itself. So for those reasons, and because of site constraints and the infill and redevelopment emphasis of the code, we decided to propose, and it was ultimately approved, that we could count those types of features towards meeting the open space requirements on a lot. They didn't always have to be at ground level. That's the takeaway there. I mentioned the table of allowed setback encroachments or obstructions. And the definitions chapter, we've taken the opportunity to put definitions in place that seem to be helpful in terms of interpreting the code and modernize those that did exist, but don't think much in terms of substantive change. Stepping back a couple of chapters, there is a chapter that follows the procedures chapter that has a kind of a common or a similar name. It's just called Administration, chapter 75. This is a holding place for long-standing provisions regarding the establishment of the Board of Adjustment, Preservation Commission, their roles and responsibilities, their duties, their makeups. Those all reside in that chapter 75. There's really nothing of substantive change there. There is a chapter that closely follows that deals with nonconformities. These are, as we all know, nonconformities in the zoning, in terms of the zoning world, are things that were lawfully established but don't comply with existing regulations. Here the effort has been to clarify the rules for nonconforming situations, to provide the maximum degree of flexibility for folks who are maybe burdened by some kind of lawful nonconforming status. But by and large, there's not a great degree of substantive change there to bring to your attention. Chapter 85, which follows that, is the enforcement chapter. The main idea with the enforcement chapter is we've made it clear that the city has a variety of options for encouraging folks to voluntarily comply with the ordinance. That if you read the existing ordinance, there is a sentence or a paragraph that says, if you don't comply with this ordinance, we can fine you $500. That's sort of the idea of last resort, that the new code should have different size hammers for encouraging compliance, ranging from administrative type remedies all the way to civil and criminal type things. I don't know that these are opportunities that didn't exist before, but they're more clearly laid out in the new enforcement chapter, chapter 85, and the procedures for notifying property owners of their noncompliance and giving them an opportunity to bring things into compliance. The attempt there was to sort of clearly lay out that process. Sure why I organized this way, but I'm going to jump back now to another zoning district. It is an existing zoning district. It's worth mentioning that the parking district, the PK district, this is a district that's historically been used to find locations for satellite parking that serves maybe a commercial corridor or lots within a commercial corridor. The district has always existed. It's available to rezone property to accommodate satellite off-street parking lots, standalone parking lots. It exists under the new code. The only changes are that it requires that the parking lot itself observe the setback that exists on the street So if it happens to sort of back up to a commercial corridor and be the first lot of what heretofore was a residential setting, that it would need to observe the front building line of the houses or buildings on that backup street, so that the cars aren't essentially in the front yard of the next door, in front of the house for the next door neighbor. Other than that, the requirements are the same, except that there is a for new PK development proposals, there'd be a requirement for a masonry screening wall abutting where the PK district abuts our zoned property. The next topic is my personal favorite, and I know Bob's personal favorite.
Yeah, this is why Bob's here.
Always fun to deal with signs in a zoning code. Luckily for us, we didn't try and change the world with regard to allowed signage, because that can be a project unto itself. The main emphasis here was in collecting sign-related zoning provisions that resided in different places within the blue zoning code. Because there was kind of a scattering of sign provisions, at least in our mind, under the blue zoning code, and our expert, Bob, knew where to find them all, but the rest of us did not. So we tried to collect all those provisions, put them into a single chapter that had some sort of organizational emphasis to it. The other thing you'll notice is that those of you who decide to read that chapter will notice that some of the language is with regard to signs that are allowed in a lot of places or exempt from some of the district-based standards, things like real estate signs and driveway entrance signs. Some of that terminology has been changed. The reason we did that, and some of the regulations, frankly, the reason we did that is in response to a Supreme Court decision that came down in the last session of the Supreme Court. The case that involved a community in Arizona and its attempts to apply some sign regulations. And the emphasis from that court case was that sign regulations needed to be more content neutral. They needed to be less about having to read the sign to apply the regulations than about the physical aspects of the sign, where it was located, how tall it was, how big it was. So moving forward, I think all communities are going to try and remove as much of that content-specific kind of language from their sign code. And we were, frankly, early leaders in trying to plow our way through having to deal with that. I don't know that it's not intended to have a great deal, to result in a great deal of substantive change, but it is different. And we'll be looking forward to administering that moving forward and seeing how it works. Finally, the final thing I'll bring to your attention with regard to signs is the rules for digital displays. The zoning code calls them dynamic displays. These are electronic type signs where the message changes frequently. Video types, they go by a variety of names. We call them dynamic displays, and they're electronic, changeable message signs. For a long time, there was an active advisory group, a sign kind of industry advisory group that was working on some proposed changes to the blue zoning code, and we took some of their work and took credit for it. They did some fine work with regard to how to allow these types of signs for things like churches and schools and institutional uses that may happen to be in a residential zoning classification. Wouldn't necessarily think that the best place to allow a dynamic display sign is in a residential zoning setting, but as we all know, some of those use types are in those kinds of zoning categories, and it's reasonable, and this is evidenced by the number of Board of Adjustment approvals for those signs, to allow those types of uses to have some ability to use that new technology, because they have various events and changes, the schedule changes, and so based on some of the approvals that have been granted by the Board of Adjustment and the fine work of the Sign Advisory Board, we were able to sort of build that into the ordinance so there'll be far fewer needs going forward for those folks to go to the Board of Adjustment and plead their case for a dynamic display sign. In doing so, we added some clarification to the dynamic display signs for uses generally, meaning as we get into the commercial and industrial districts. And the city has always had, or not always, but has had for a number of years, regulations that apply to billboards that involve electronic changeable messages. The rules with regard to on-premise business signs were a little less clear, at least in our mind, and so we've clarified the rules that apply to those signs, and they're very similar to the rules that apply to the billboard type or off-premise signs. There are restrictions on the size of the dynamic display element that can be in place. There are restrictions on how often the message can change, and the brightness, illumination level for those signs in an effort to sort of allow the technology but place reasonable restrictions on it. Not sure that the sign industry is 100% on board. I think they're generally on board with those changes, but some of the restrictions on on-premise business signs, I think, they're still mulling over whether they're totally in support of those, but they're in place, is the bottom line. There are restrictions on the size. There are requirements that the message hold for, I believe it's 8 seconds before it changes again, and that's to prevent the use of full motion video displays for every commercial and industrial zone property in town, and the impacts that might have on traffic safety and aesthetics and lighting and the like. So those provisions were adopted. What did I forget about? Give him the mic. He's got to talk. He's got to demonstrate his expertise.
I think you covered all the aspects of signs. And I'll just kind of open up. Does anybody have anything? The application submittal is still the same. There weren't any changes there. I would mention, though, if you were going to submit an application for a dynamic display, you might want on your site plan elevations just mention about your dwell time and transition time so that we make sure that the signs are in compliance, with your submittal. I think that's the only thing that I had to mention at this time.
I might ask, are there any changes to the outdoor advertising signs or to spacing requirements, or a sign must be on the property for the business that it advertises?
Well, that's an on-premise business sign. No changes to outdoor advertising signs in the aware of regarding spacing and separation.
On the 60.0200, on signs that, page 60, that attached to a motor vehicle, you cannot park your car out in the parking lot unless you're close to the building.
Are you prohibited signs?
Yeah. It's prohibitive if you're drawing attention to your business, you cannot have a sign on your car, a wrap or anything like that.
60020 which?
Oh, the very last one on 20-. Oh,
okay. Yeah, no, that's not new. That's still in the, just kind of carried over from the current code. That it would be no closer than the nearest building wall.
The intention here is to really address the most sort of egregious aspects of somebody pulling their delivery vehicle into the nearest parking space closest to the street and leaving it there for weeks on end in order to sort of circumvent the restrictions on signage. There are clearly going to be instances where personal vehicles are, and it just gives the city something to enforce in those worst case.
Do you need us to help you peel that off your car, Mike?
I have a friend.
Yeah. Any other questions on anything?
And I didn't say anything on neons. I've not read, this is one chapter I have not read thoroughly.
HP I did, but this one I did not. Neons, there's no exemption or
That'd just be an electrical sign.
Any questions on anything? Anything you've been waiting to ask all day long, now's the time, because we have covered our topics. Okay.
Can you summarize all the zoning cases? They go to the city for deficiency.
Right, no. I would.
New zoning cases go to INCOG for preliminary discussion.
Right, if you know that you need a zoning change to do whatever you need to do, you need to come and talk to us.
And
Yes.
then what?
If you need, if you have the correct zoning but need some type of relief and you're just not entirely sure what that is, you would go and submit through what's the word for that? Zoning clearance permit. And then they will, through that review process, issue you a letter of deficiency. It's really the board process that goes to the city first, just so that, because that, you're kind of almost ready to get your permit, but there's some board adjustments that might need to be taken first. But no, come to us, we'll talk about your zoning. Even if your zoning is right or not right or whatever, we can always help you with your zoning questions.
Do all zoning cases go to the city council?
Yes.
And planning commission?
Yes, all rezoning cases, yes.
And does INCOG anticipate longer review times because of all their added responsibilities?
No, our review time is the same. There's,
Might repeat this
he asked me, do we anticipate any longer review times? No, not at all. I really think there's a lot of shifting going on. I didn't see it as like adding a lot of stuff to the end. A lot of the things we used to have to prepare staff reports for site plans to go to planning commission. Well, we don't have to do that anymore. That's administratively approved. So, there are some things that kind of shave off time-consuming things, and then there's some things that add. So I kind of see it as a wash. I don't see it as any bigger burden as far as time and delays in any of the work we do. Yes?
Going back to PUDs that are now inactive or have been shut down, I understand that the development plan associated with zoning, I can put on a piece of property as long as I'm more restrictive. So how do you make things less restrictive that you could do under a PUD? What's the replacement for PUDs?
Okay, so let me just clarify. The first part of what you said, PUDs as they've been approved, those remain.
Right.
So those don't change. MPD is the tool that was really put in place to, instead of the PUD. It's just at this point in time, we really think that's a last resort because there's so many other options. But that is the thing that would loosen restrictions.
Got that part.
Okay.
Now we get to the part of if I can find a zoning category that will work under the comprehensive plan for the parcel that I want. I see that I have a lot of tools here. But what if I don't? What options do we
Well,
have?
and that's where we start looking at MPDs. When we look at all the other zoning districts and whatever development scenario you have in mind, and it doesn't work, but it's a good idea, it's a good plan, it's good for the city, it provides some kind of good public benefit to the city, then yeah, that's when we look at an MPD.
So you're saying there's the only thing to really do relief, get relief from a underlying zoning is MPD in order to really, they're just trying to find a zoning category that fits better?
There are so many other tools that provide relief to the categories we had before.
Building setbacks and things of that nature.
Right, like for instance, setbacks, that's a good example. Because commercial districts, those setbacks are greatly reduced, commercial and office, and industrial, I think, as well. So, a lot of those factors have been adjusted that, and then with the smaller residential lots that are available in our spot. So there's so many things that have been adjusted that people used to come in, driveway coverage. That's also been, did we talk about that or not? I'm not sure.
Yeah, but that's a good point.
So, there's so many things that we used to see PUDs for that were just single purpose, I need this thing, that we've adjusted in the code That I just, there's gonna be a lot of that that's not needed anymore.
What about like in a private street situation, which you can only do with a PUD, or only if you still do with a PUD? And you want your buildings closer, you got a 30-foot roadway easement, and you don't want to, so you want 20-foot setback. In a larger lot, in a subdivision.
The question is, if you have a private street development and you want to develop it with a 30-foot wide street right-of-way and reduce building setbacks, those kind of things, the NPD will be the only way to do that. But still,
Or corridor.
well, yeah, we've never done it in corridor, but you can do it that way.
It depends on the location.
You could do something like a standard residential subdivision.
Oh,
you all
that's
have
true.
seen in all projects, a lot have done, that have standard lot sizes on private streets and gate streets. So
The-
PUD
yeah.
is really good.
Yeah, so again, the only tool we have in the new code to allow a subdivision with private streets is going to be an NPD, except, I guess, in the cottage development type things, I mean, there are opportunities to do some of those kind of things, but in the more traditional sense that you're probably thinking about, that's the only method we've got. Now, one thing, that was actually one of the things that I've marked here, is to talk about the driveways for the people that are designing subdivisions and building homes. That's one of the things that we changed in the zoning code, is that there's now, the blue code had a standard of maximum front yard coverage, which prohibited 3 car wide driveways, which in greenfield projects where new buildings or new homes are being built, that seems to be a market trend. So we have allowed that as part of the zoning code, but it's limited back down to 2 driveway widths at the right-of-way line. So as you get closer to the house, you can build a wider driveway, but we felt like it was important for the team that worked all together on this felt like it was important to kind of keep that streetscape as green as possible in a subdivision.
Entry to the drive is a standard width.
Right, that's right. So it tapers down actually at the right-of-way line.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Can you describe what the process would be if we have an existing PUD that we want to make modifications to?
It's just, if the question is, if we have an existing PUD, how can we modify that? It's the same process that we had last year. So if it's a major amendment to the PUD, it comes through us. It goes to the planning commission and then goes to city council for approval. If it's
So an
minor.
existing PUD would maintain its legacy
Yes,
status from
yes.
now on and just be reviewed under the old process?
That's correct. That's
What
correct.
what if the owner of the parcel that has the PUD purchases the land next door, and it's not in the PUD, but he wants to incorporate it within the development, expand the development?
That's one of the things. The question is, can you expand the boundaries of a PUD? And the answer to that is no.
But the need to do something like that might occur, so how would you do it? How would you buy more land and expand your development?
So if you wanted to expand the PUD, I think the easy answer without really knowing the particulars is that you would probably abandon the PUD and do an NPD to cover all of that. Yeah.
Kevin?
The special area overlays, can those cross over streets, alleys?
They
Yes.
will, yes, absolutely.
That all have to be.
Repeat the question.
He asked me a special area overlay, can you cover streets and alleys, and the answer is yes. We see this being a significant, could be a significantly sized district, small neighborhood, at least an acre, could be really big. What was the second part of your question?
Does it have to be contiguous?
Yes. We haven't really, but I mean, it has to be, I guess you could have different segments, but it would all have to be, meet the minimum 10 lots or 1 acre. But you could, I guess, still have.
And.
So.
Boundary that you could draw.
Yeah.
Is there some correlation then between the special area overlay and a small area plan?
There could be. Yeah, I mean, a small, yeah, a special area overlay could come out of a small area plan. That could be the justification. That's one of the criteria that is consistent, so it absolutely could come out of a small area plan.
Well, going back to what you said, it needs to either be based on a plan or follow that rigorous public outreach process.
Right, yeah, that's right. And that's part, in the early part of the overlay chapter, it talks about, that was a lot of discussion we had is, first it had to be based on a plan, because if it was based on a plan and they went through the planning process, there was already a lot of public involvement there. So now the way the wording is, if it was part of a small area plan, they don't have to follow this rigorous new public process to go through it. They can sort of fall back on that small area plan process. So it's helpful if it was part of a small area plan. Last chance. Any other, you guys want to say anything? Okay, here, give her, she needs a mic.
So we call what Kurt just referred to, at least in part, as housekeeping amendments. And if any of you see anything that you consider a housekeeping amendment or whatever that needs to be addressed, if you just send one of us an email, that would be great. We're kind of keeping a pile of them. So if you find anything, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, well, if you don't have anything else, then we can go back to work or whatever, but I really appreciate you guys coming. It was so great to see you, and it was so great to see you back after lunch. So, we're easy to find. We're at INCOG all the time, and they're at the city all the time, so feel free to contact us with any questions. John?
I have one quick question.
Okay.
First, I want to compliment you. You mentioned 2 blue books. I used to work with zoning back before the first blue book. There was a blue book many years ago. So when you say blue book, I think way back some time. But you have a provision in there that talks about multifamily kind of apartment condo. But there are projects in Tulsa, several, that are condominium projects that they are really just single family homes. Just the use of that terminology causing problems. Because it's really just a legal definition.
That's correct. I don't think it hasn't. The question was, there is the use type that is really an apartment building or an apartment complex is referred to in the zoning code as apartment condo. And the question was, condominiums can exist for even detached single-family townhouse style projects, and does that wording have any negative implications or pose any obstacles for folks who want to do that in the future? The answer in my mind is clearly no, that condominium regime provisions are pretty much divorced from zoning. We merely use the term because for some people, the word condo is a more positive term than apartment, and so we wanted to encompass both within that.
I want to compliment you, consultants, staff, and everyone. This is an excellent code. It's something we've been needing to talk for years.
Thank you, I agree.
It's excellent. Thank you.
Mark?
There's a continuing education a lot of architects need. Will we get some sort of, or can we get some sort of verification from you that we would attend here today?
Yeah, you just need to let me know what you need.
So,